The fiancée wrapped her hands around the poor maid's throat to silence her forever. But the Mafia boss's little daughter made one choice that brought an entire empire to its knees. In the most heavily guarded mansion in Chicago, a house where security cameras watched every hallway and armed men stood at every gate, there were only two people who ever saw the truth hiding behind that woman's flawless smile. A maid so poor she'd once slept in her car for 2 months straight, and a 4-year-old girl who hadn't spoken a single word since the day her mother died. Massimo Falcone was 37 years old, and by every measure that mattered in the world he ruled, he was untouchable. He controlled the ports, the real estate, the underground money that flowed through the city like a second river, and men twice his size lowered their eyes when he walked into a room. But behind the iron gates of his Gold Coast estate, the most powerful man in Chicago couldn't fix the one thing that was truly broken, his little girl, Bianca, who'd gone silent 3 years ago after the car accident that took her mother. An accident Massimo had never once believed was an accident at all. Into that cold, quiet house came Delilah Quinn. 27 years old, a woman life had beaten down over and over again, orphaned young, buried in hospital debt after cancer took her mother, robbed blind by a man who'd promised to marry her and vanished instead. She took the job as a maid in the Falcone mansion because, as she told herself the night she signed the contract, a starving woman can't afford to be scared of ghosts. What nobody expected, not the bodyguards, not the doctors, not even Massimo himself, was that this quiet, watchful maid would do what a fortune in specialists never could. 3 weeks after Delilah arrived, little Bianca spoke her first word in 3 years. And then came Vanessa Sterling. 29, stunning, polished, an art curator with a perfect laugh and a perfect story. The woman who slipped a ring onto her finger within 5 months and started planning a wedding that would make her the lady of the house, to Massimo. She was warmth after years of winter. But Delilah saw what he couldn't, the way Vanessa's sweet voice turned to ice the second his motorcade cleared the gate. The strange man in the gray jacket she kept meeting in the greenhouse after secretly looping the security feeds. And the way little Bianca went completely silent again, every single time that woman entered the room. For months, the maid watched. For months, she didn't say a word, because who on earth believes the help over the bride? And when Delilah finally found the courage to speak up, Vanessa didn't just deny it, she set a trap so cruel, so perfectly staged, that it got the only honest woman in that house thrown out the front gates in disgrace, while a 4-year-old screamed her first words in years begging her not to go. But here's what that beautiful, scheming bride never counted on. A maid who'd survived the bottom of life doesn't run, she digs. And what Delilah dug up about that so-called accident 3 years ago wasn't just a secret, it was a truth, dark enough to burn the whole engagement to the ground. A truth that would put her back inside that mansion, just in time for Vanessa to wrap both hands around her throat, in a hallway where the cameras weren't watching. What happened next came down to one locked door, one trembling little girl, and one small star-shaped button on a child's watch, because in a house where everyone wore a mask, the child who'd never learned to lie knew exactly which button to press. If you love raw, emotional stories with twists you won't see coming, hit that like button right now so more people can find this story. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the quietest voices often carry the biggest truths. And subscribe to the channel, because we bring you a brand new story just like this every single week. Now, let's get back to that cold, magnificent mansion on Chicago's Gold Coast, where our story truly begins. The southern harbor of Chicago at 5 o'clock in the morning lay submerged in a thin gray mist rising from the surface of Lake Michigan, and between rows of containers stacked high like mountains of steel, a convoy of gleaming black cars rolled silently through the security gate without a single guard daring to ask them to stop for inspection. Massimo Falcone sat in the back seat of the middle car, his silver cuff links flashing beneath the harsh floodlights, his dark brown eyes looking through the bulletproof glass toward warehouse number 7, where the meeting was waiting for him. People said there were 2 kinds of power in this city, the kind that was elected and the kind that didn't need anyone to elect it, and Massimo belonged to the second kind. When the warehouse door opened, the 12 men seated around the long table all rose at once. No one had asked them to do it, and no one dared not to. He passed them with steady steps, neither fast nor slow, and in the moment he moved by, each pair of eyes lowered in turn like candles being blown out one after another by the wind. The meeting lasted exactly 20 minutes. Massimo barely spoke. He listened, and it was his silence that made the room suffocate, because every man sitting there understood that the boss of the Falcone family never needed to raise his voice. The men who had to raise their voices were the ones who still needed to prove something. He didn't. When the manager of Berth 3 awkwardly reported that a shipment had been delayed by 2 days, the entire table stiffened and waited, but Massimo only set his pen down on the wooden tabletop, a sound so small it almost didn't exist. And yet the man at the far end of the table, a man half again as large as he was, went pale and promised to resolve it today in the voice of a schoolboy reciting a lesson before the class. At noon, his car stopped in front of an old Italian restaurant in Bridgeport, where he had lunch with 2 city council members, and what mattered was not the conversation itself, but the way the young patrol officer across the street hurriedly turned his face away and pretended to check his radio when he realized whom that convoy belonged to. In Chicago, the law had invisible borders, and everyone who had worn a uniform long enough knew that map by heart. Paulie Russo, the salt and pepper-haired man who had stood beside the Falcone family since before Massimo took power, sat across from him in the car on the way back, skimming through reports and occasionally glancing at his boss, with the eyes of a man who had seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore, yet had never stopped worrying about one thing: the emptiness growing thicker and thicker behind the eyes of the most powerful man in the city. The sun sank behind the skyline of skyscrapers as the convoy turned into the Gold Coast, where historic mansions, more than 100 years old, stood motionless behind intricately wrought iron fences, and the enormous black gate of the Falcone estate opened, then closed behind him with a deep metallic sound like the lid of a precious box being shut, or perhaps the lid of a coffin. Inside that gate, Massimo's power remained intact, but it took on another shape, colder and more silent. The household staff moved like carefully trained shadows. No one spoke unless spoken to. No one looked the master of the house directly in the eye, and their footsteps on the marble floor were so light that the house, nearly 11,000 square feet wide, sounded like a museum after closing time. Dinner was served in the grand dining room beneath the glow of a crystal chandelier. At a long table with 16 seats polished so brightly it reflected the ceiling above, and at the head of it sat 1 set of silverware, 1 plate of hot food, 1 glass of red wine for exactly 1 person. Massimo ate in silence, his back straight, his movements precise, as though even when no one was there to witness him, he still didn't allow himself to loosen his hold, because loosening one's hold was a luxury that men in his position couldn't afford at any price. The sound of a spoon touching porcelain rang out, then dissolved into the vast emptiness of the room, and if anyone had stood at a distance and watched, they would have seen a strange contradiction. The man who made the entire harbor hold its breath that morning, now looking oddly small now in the middle of his own home. After dinner, he climbed the grand oak staircase, the thick carpet in the second-floor hallway swallowing every footstep. On both walls hung oil paintings lit by warm golden spotlights, and he stopped as he had stopped every night for 3 years, before a white door painted with tiny faded stars. Behind that door was his daughter, and between them was a distance no measuring tape could ever measure. He lifted his hand, the same fingers that had signed million-dollar contracts and decided the fate of more than a few people in this city, and they paused a few inches from the wood before slowly lowering again. No sound came from inside, no laughter, no crying, not even the small rustle of someone turning in bed, only that thick, suffocating silence that the finest specialists in America, with invoices as long as the list of his sins, had all failed to break. Massimo stood there for another minute, the man who could buy anything in this city standing helpless before an unlocked child's door. Then he turned away and walked toward the study at the end of the hallway, where stacks of paperwork were waiting, because work was the only language he still knew how to speak. And tonight, just like the 1,000 nights before it, the kingdom behind Massimo Falcone's iron gate sank once more into an order so perfect, so magnificent, and so empty that it reached all the way down to the bone. The study at the end of the hallway welcomed him with the familiar scent of leather and polished wood, but tonight the stacks of paperwork couldn't hold Massimo's mind for more than 10 minutes, because outside the tall window, rain began to fall. And nighttime rain in Chicago was always the key that opened the cellar of memory he had kept locked with every ounce of his will for 3 years. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and as always, the memory didn't ask permission. It simply flooded in. 3 years earlier had been a rainy night just like this one. Katerina called him at 9:15 in the evening from her mother's house in Lincoln Park, her voice warm and a little drowsy, telling him that Bianca had fallen asleep in the child seat in the back, that all evening the little girl had kept babbling the one word she had just learned the week before, "Mama, mama, mama," like a song with only one note, and Katerina laughed into the phone and said she was beginning to suspect his daughter would never agree to learn the word papa, so he should prepare himself. Massimo had been standing in the middle of a meeting then. He answered briefly, telling her to drive carefully, because Dusable Lake Shore Drive was slippery, then hung up before she had the chance to say her familiar goodbye. He had replayed that 19-second call in his head thousands of times over 3 years, and every time, he stopped in the exact same place. If only he had listened to the rest of that goodbye. If only he had kept her on the line for 1 more minute, then perhaps her car would have passed that stretch of road 1 minute later, and everything would have been different. The second call came at 5 minutes to 10. From an unknown number, a man's voice identifying himself as a patrol officer, and Massimo didn't remember anything the man said after the first 5 words. "Sir, there's been an accident." He only remembered the sound of rain striking the windshield the whole way as he drove himself to Northwestern Memorial Hospital, like a man who had lost his mind, remembered the blinding white brightness of the emergency corridor, remembered the night shift chief physician taking off his glasses before he spoke, and people only took off their glasses when the news was heavy enough that they didn't want to see the listener's face clearly. Katerina was gone before the ambulance could reach the hospital. They told him she hadn't suffered long, and he never knew whether that was true or only the thing people said to everyone left behind. Bianca, 13 months old, had been saved by the rear-facing child seat, not a scratch on her body, asleep in a nurse's arms when Massimo rushed in. And the moment he lifted his daughter, she opened her eyes and looked at him, those brown eyes so cruelly like her mother's, then closed them again, without crying, without making a single sound. He hadn't understood then. It took weeks, then months, before the family realized that from that rainy night on, the babbling had left the little girl as though it had never existed at all. The word mama never rang out again. No word rang out again. The doctors called it by long terms: trauma, selective mutism. They said the child's body was completely healthy, her vocal cords intact, her hearing perfect, only somewhere inside her a door had closed, and none of them, with all their degrees covering the walls, knew where the key was. But there was one thing that haunted Massimo even more than grief, and that was the questions with no answers. The scene report stated that a second vehicle had struck the rear of Katerina's car at high speed, causing her to lose control in the rain. A hit and run, a phrase neat enough to feel cold, but that vehicle seemed to vanish into thin air. Not one traffic camera along that stretch of road was working that night, a coincidence that still made the back of Massimo's neck turn ice cold whenever he thought about it. No witnesses, no paint fragments, no license plate, nothing at all. And then the case file was closed after only 9 weeks. 9 weeks for the death of the wife of a man whose name the entire Chicago Police Department knew, with the brief conclusion that there wasn't enough evidence to continue the investigation. Massimo had sat across from the detective in charge of the case, looked him straight in the eye, and asked why it had happened so quickly. And that man, a man with 20 years on the job, had looked down at the file instead of looking at him when he answered that sometimes there were cases that could never be solved. "Mr. Falcone, I'm very sorry. People in Massimo's world didn't believe in coincidences. They survived because they didn't believe in coincidences. And over the past 3 years he had turned over every underground connection. He had to find a clue, a name, a reason. But someone had cleaned everything up with such perfection that the cleanliness itself became the only confession left behind. Proof that the rainy night had not been an accident. He simply couldn't prove it. He couldn't take revenge on a ghost. And the only thing he could do was turn this house into a fortress, turn his heart into a locked room exactly like the room with the faded stars at the end of the hallway. The clock struck 1 o'clock in the morning. The rain outside the window had thinned into delicate strands. Massimo opened his eyes, poured himself a glass of liquor he didn't bother to drink, and in the stillness of the study, the most powerful man in Chicago admitted to the darkness, the thing he had never said to anyone still alive, that he wasn't afraid of any enemy out there. He was afraid of only one thing, that his daughter would grow up silent inside her own father's house, and that he would grow old without ever once hearing her call him Papa. 7.5 miles southwest of the Gold Coast mansion, on the same nights when Massimo Falcone sat alone with a glass of liquor he didn't bother to drink, there was a 27-year-old woman learning how to sleep. Sitting upright behind the wheel of an old Honda, parked in a supermarket lot, where the floodlights were bright enough to keep her safe, but also bright enough to make sure she never forgot where she was. Delilah Quinn kept everything she had left in 2 canvas bags on the back seat, and a yellow envelope tucked under the sun visor, an envelope she no longer needed to open because she had memorized every number inside it. $90,000 in unpaid hospital bills, printed in bold, along with the final notice before the file would be transferred to a debt collection agency. There were nights when she lay on her side across the seat, watching the supermarket lights flicker through the windshield, and memory found its way back to her like water, seeping through the crack beneath the door. The charity hospital room on the south side, the pale blue dividing curtain, and her mother's hand in hers, so thin she could feel every knuckle. Her mother had held her hand that way through the last 6 months, and the strange thing was that, even now, what Delilah remembered most was not the sound of the machines or the smell of antiseptic, but the way her mother, even when pain had eaten its way all the way into her sleep, still turned to ask the night nurse whether her daughter looked too tired today, whether she had eaten anything. Her mother had spent her whole life cleaning other people's houses, her whole life invisible inside beautiful homes, and she left this world with calloused hands and one final instruction. You look at people with your eyes, but you read them by the things they do when they think no one is watching. Delilah had read many things that way, except for the one time she let her heart read in place of her eyes, and that time she paid for it with everything. His name was Kyle, an insurance broker, with an easy smile and a modest engagement ring. He told her to put her savings and the condolence money from her mother's funeral into a joint account so he could invest it and gradually pay off the hospital debt, and she, exhausted after the burial, blind from the rare kindness that had appeared in the middle of a dark stretch of days, signed. 3 weeks later, the joint account was empty. His phone number had become an endless ringing tone. The apartment he had rented held nothing but a bent coat hanger on the floor. And Delilah learned the most expensive lesson of her life, that the most dangerous people never look dangerous. So on the morning she walked into the small coffee shop on Oak Street to meet a woman named Ida Brennan about a housekeeping job listed in a notice, introduced by an acquaintance at the laundromat. Delilah sat down with the eyes of someone who had nothing left to lose, but who was no longer easy to fool either. Mrs. Brennan was around 60, her silver hair pinned into a neat bun, her back straight as a ruler, and Delilah read her in the first 10 seconds exactly as her mother had taught her. The old leather shoes, carefully polished, said this was a woman who valued discipline more than appearance. The fingers interlaced and resting still on the table said she had nothing to hide, but had a great many things she wasn't allowed to say. And the way her eyes moved over Delilah from her shoes to her shoulders, then stopped for a long while on her hands with calluses in the exact places of someone who had truly worked, before she gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The interview was strangely short. Mrs. Brennan didn't ask much about experience, but asked questions that seemed almost beside the point. What would you do if you picked up something valuable that had fallen in the employer's house? What would you do if you overheard a phone call that wasn't meant for your ears? And Delilah answered each question slowly, with a naked kind of honesty. I put it back where it belongs and report it to the manager. I go somewhere else and forget it, because people in my position keep their jobs with clean hands and a short memory. For the first time during the meeting, the corner of Mrs. Brennan's mouth moved upward by 1 millimeter, and she said the pay would be considerably higher than the usual rate, with room and board included, but there were rules in that house that would not appear in any contract. Then she placed a printed address on the table, and when Delilah read the words Gold Coast and the last name printed beneath them, she understood at once why the salary was so high. All of Chicago knew that name. The acquaintance at the laundromat had once lowered her voice, while telling her about the black cars moving in and out of that neighborhood, about how even the garbage collectors had to go through background checks. That night, Delilah sat in the Honda with the yellow envelope on her lap, and she did the only calculation people at the bottom of the pit knew how to make. On one side, a vague fear of a name, on the other $90,000 of debt, nights spent sleeping upright, the knock at the door from debt collectors, and she said aloud in the car, alone, the sentence that would follow her through the iron gate: a person starving to death doesn't have the right to be afraid of ghosts. 3 days later, when the taxi dropped her in front of the Falcone mansion in the late afternoon, Delilah stood for 1 minute before the black gate that rose 3 times taller than she was, 2 canvas bags in her hands, and her old instinct immediately went to work. She read the house the way she would read a person. The upper floor windows were lit, but not a single shadow moved, which said this was a place of wealth without life. The trees were trimmed so perfectly that not one leaf seemed out of place, which said its owner controlled everything within sight. And when the iron gate opened, then closed behind her with a deep metallic sound, Delilah Quinn drew a deep breath, tightened her grip on the straps of her bags, and had no idea that she had just stepped into the place that would take from her more than everything she had already lost, and would also return to her the one thing she thought life would never give her again. On the first evening, Mrs. Brennan led Delilah on a tour through the servants' quarters in the West Wing, a private hallway, a private staircase, a small clean room with a twin bed, and a window overlooking the rose garden, and the whole way, she spoke in the even voice of someone who had delivered this lecture far too many times but had never allowed it to become mere formality. In this house, you start work at 6 o'clock in the morning. Your area is the first floor and the second floor hallway. You do not enter the master's study unless you're summoned. You do not use your phone during working hours. You do not take photographs of anything, not even a flower in the garden. Then she stopped in the middle of the hallway, turned fully around to look Delilah straight in the eye, and lowered her voice just enough for the next sentence to carry a weight entirely different from the ones before it. Miss Quinn, I've worked here since the master's father's time, and I've seen more people leave through that gate than I've welcomed in. Almost all of them left not because their hands did poor work, but because they failed to understand one thing. In this house, the ears are the most dangerous part of a servant's body. Eyes can close, mouths can stay shut, but ears cannot close themselves, so you must learn to let whatever enters them run straight back out like water through a basket, not lingering, not being repeated, not even being thought about again. Do you understand? Delilah nodded, and she truly did understand, in the way of someone who had once paid dearly for trusting the wrong person. But that very first night, lying on the twin bed and listening to the wind moving through the rose garden, she realized the contradiction that would follow her through the months to come. That a person could give orders to the ears, but not to instinct, and her instinct, the thing tempered through years of reading creditors, reading doctors, reading con men with pleasant smiles, had no off switch. The first week passed in the rhythm of a gilded monastery. Delilah cleaned marble floors polished bright enough to reflect her face, shined silver sets no one ever used, vacuumed sitting rooms that had no guests, and she realized this house was splendid in the way a jewelry box was splendid. Everything perfect, expensive, precisely arranged, yet utterly missing the scratches of life. No half-read newspaper on a table. No pair of shoes kicked off in a hurry by the door. No television sounds drifting from some room, only the noise of her own vacuum and the sound of the other servants moving as lightly as paper. She learned their names little by little, the 2 gardeners, 1 cook, 2 security men who changed shifts at the gatehouse, and she realized all of them shared the same kind of silence. Not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the silence of people who had locked away everything they knew inside a drawer with many layers of locks. The first time she saw the master of the house was on Thursday morning. She was wiping the banister of the grand staircase when she heard the front door open, and the air in the foyer changed even before the man stepped inside. The butler stood straighter. The security guard in the corner of the foyer seemed almost to turn to stone, and Massimo Falcone crossed the entrance hall with a black overcoat draped over one arm, his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in short sentences in a low voice that didn't need to rise or fall to make whoever was listening on the other end sit up straighter. By the reflex Mrs. Brennan had trained into them, every servant within sight lowered their eyes to the floor, but Delilah, still holding the cleaning cloth, merely stepped back once to clear his path as proper manners required, while her eyes did not lower, not out of defiance, but because the instinct in her that read people would not allow her to miss 10 seconds of observing a man the whole city dared mention only in whispers, and in those 10 seconds, she read more than all the rumors put together. The perfectly tailored suit, but the tie loosened just a little more than strictness allowed, said he hadn't slept enough the night before. The footsteps, even to the last measure, and wasting not a single beat, said this was a man who controlled himself down to every breath, and the dark shadows beneath his eyes, the thing no tailor could conceal, said this man was carrying a wound that did not lie on his body. Just as she reached that reading, Massimo stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence, as though he had sensed the only gaze in the foyer that had not lowered, and he turned his head. Their eyes met for no more than 2 seconds, brief enough not to become insolent, long enough for both of them to know it had happened. His dark brown eyes swept over her with the fleeting irritation of a man who had discovered something out of place in his perfectly arranged house, a new servant who did not know the rules. But, beneath that irritation, something else flashed and went out, something close to unwilling attention, because it had been a very long time since anyone in this house had looked at him as a human being instead of a storm to be avoided. Then he turned away, continued the call, and climbed the stairs past her without saying a word, leaving behind the faint scent of cedarwood and a Delilah who told herself in silence, "Remember this, in this place. Lower your eyes, don't be foolish." But the moment that truly marked her during that first week was not the encounter with the master. It was Friday afternoon, when she was wiping the frames of the paintings along the second-floor hallway, and heard a sound so soft it almost wasn't there. She turned, and at the end of the corridor, in front of the white door painted with faded stars, a little girl was standing there watching her. The child was tiny in a cream-colored dress, her brown hair tied on both sides in careful braids, and she stood still in a way no 4-year-old child Delilah had ever met could stand still, not fidgeting, not coming closer in curiosity, only observing her with large brown eyes, deep and silent as the surface of a well. Delilah smiled in greeting, the softest smile she had. The little girl did not smile back. She did not run away. She only looked a while longer, then quietly retreated into her room, the door closing without a sound, and Delilah stood in the splendid hallway filled with afternoon sun, the cleaning cloth still in her hand, suddenly understanding, with the intuition of someone who had sat beside too much pain, that the true heart of this silent house did not lie inside the study of that powerful man, but behind the child's door with the faded stars, where there was a little girl moving through her own home like a small shadow, and Delilah's instinct whispered that this shadow was waiting for something, or someone, that no one in this entire house had managed to find. After that afternoon, Delilah began to notice the little shadow appearing more often at the edge of her vision. When she cleaned the living room floor, the child sat on the third stair, holding an old stuffed rabbit. When she watered the potted plants in the reading room, the child stood tucked behind the doorframe, and Delilah, with the kind of wisdom no school could teach, chose the only right thing to do. She did nothing at all. She didn't wave her over, didn't shower her with questions, didn't tilt her head and make silly faces the way adults always did with children. She simply continued her work, and now and then, when she looked up and caught the girl's eyes, she smiled once and left it at that, as though the child's presence were the most natural thing in the world, needing neither welcome nor dismissal, because her mother had once told her, if you want a stray cat to come close, never step toward it. Sit still and let it believe coming closer was its own idea. By the second week, the distances began to close on their own. The little girl moved from the third stair down to the bottom stair, from behind the doorframe all the way into the room, and one morning, when Delilah was kneeling to wipe the baseboard along the second-floor hallway, she heard tiny footsteps stop behind her. But when she turned, the corridor was empty, and all that remained on the lid of her blue cleaning bucket was a candy wrapped in shining gold paper, placed neatly in the exact center, like an offering presented with all the solemn ceremony a 4-year-old soul could possess. Delilah picked up the candy, and the woman who hadn't cried at her mother's funeral, because her tears had already dried up before it, who hadn't cried when she discovered the account was empty, suddenly felt her throat tighten over a 2-cent piece of candy. She unwrapped it and ate it right there, even though she didn't know for certain whether the child was still watching, then spoke just loudly enough into the emptiness of the hallway. "Thank you, little miss. That candy is very good." The next day, there was another candy on the bucket lid, this one wrapped in red paper, and so it became a secret ritual between the two of them. Wordless, without facing each other, only candies changing color from day to day, like a conversation written in a language no one had yet invented letters for. Then came the first rainy afternoon of the month, when the garden outside was soaked through, and the whole house had sunk into a soft gray light. Delilah was assigned to clean the playroom at the end of the east wing, and when she stepped inside, she saw Bianca sitting in the middle of the rug with a wooden puzzle box spilled open around her, pieces shaped like a house, a fence, and a sun scattered everywhere. Instead of retreating or asking whether the child needed help, Delilah did the one thing none of the specialists who had passed through this house with thick invoices had thought to do. She quietly sat down at the edge of the rug, an arm's length away from the child, picked up a few puzzle pieces for herself, and began assembling her own section, without looking at the child, without saying a word. The two of them worked side by side in the steady sound of rain tapping against the window frame, and when Bianca's tiny hand pushed toward her a chimney piece that the house Delilah was building was missing, Delilah accepted it, set it into its proper place, and heard from the child a very soft exhale, the sound closest to peace that room had held in 3 years. From that day on, parallel puzzling became their second language after the candies, and Delilah obeyed one iron rule she had set for herself. She never asked the child a question that required an answer in words. She never said anything that contained the word "say it." She only narrated the world in a warm, even voice like a radio late at night. "It's raining so hard today, isn't it? This piece is red. I dropped the sun piece. How clumsy of me." And every time she knelt down to the child's level, she truly knelt all the way down to the floor, low as Bianca, eye to eye with her, because she understood from her own childhood that to a child, the whole adult world was made of walking towers, and no one tells their secrets to a tower. 3 weeks after she had stepped through the iron gate, on a Tuesday morning so ordinary, there was nothing about it worth remembering, Delilah was putting the puzzle pieces back into the box when she realized the chimney piece was missing. She lifted the rug, bent to search beneath the armchair, her mouth still keeping up the familiar radio rhythm. Well now, where did that chimney piece go? It's disappeared. And at that exact moment, from behind her came a sound that made all the air in the room stop moving. A small voice, rough, unsteady, like the hinge of a door no one had opened in 3 years, Delilah froze where she was bent over, not daring to turn around at once, not daring to breathe too hard, because instinct screamed inside her that this moment was as fragile as the first ice of the season, and one unnecessary movement would be enough to shatter it. Then slowly, very slowly, she turned and saw Bianca standing there, the stuffed rabbit clenched tightly in one hand, the other tiny hand holding out the chimney puzzle piece, her deep brown eyes fixed on Delilah, and her small lips moved again, clearer this time, steadier, as though she had been practicing this sentence in her head for many nights. Della's. Delilah didn't know how she managed to take that puzzle piece. She only knew that both her knees touched the floor, and she heard her own voice come out miraculously calm, while everything inside her trembled. "That's right, Della's. Thank you, sweetheart. You're very good at finding things." She didn't burst into tears, didn't sweep the child into her arms, didn't turn the moment into an event that might frighten the child into retreating. She simply received that first voice after 3 years as gently as if she were receiving a bird landing in her palm. But there had been a third person who heard everything, Mrs. Ida Brennan, standing motionless just outside the playroom threshold with a stack of table linens in her hands. The woman of steel who had served this family through 2 generations, who had seen one mistress laid to rest and watched the child of the house sink into silence, was standing there now with the stack of linens trembling in her hands, 2 streams of tears running down her 60-year-old face, without any attempt to wipe them away. Because for 3 years this entire house had learned to live with the child's silence the way people lived with a scar, had stopped daring to hope. And yet this morning, in the middle of a Tuesday with nothing memorable about it, a miracle had walked into this house wearing the old canvas shoes of a maid, and the first name it called was not anyone who carried the Falcone name, but Della, 2 clumsy syllables. The first gift that child had been placed into the world with her own hands after 3 years, set neatly into the heart of the poorest woman in the richest house in the Gold Coast, as neatly as the first candy on the lid of the blue cleaning bucket. Mrs. Brennan kept to the very quality that had helped her survive 40 years in this house. She didn't run off to announce it, didn't turn the miracle into news. She only quietly adjusted the work schedule so Delilah would be assigned more often to the areas near the playroom, and over the following weeks, the bricks of the wall of silence began to fall one by one. From only saying Della, Bianca began to say candy, rabbit, rain, single scattered words like the first drops of water leaking from a cracked dam, and every new word was received by Delilah with the same old formula, calm on the outside, shaken to the core within, never clapping or cheering as though the child had performed a trick, only nodding and continuing on, as if her voice had never left her at all. Massimo knew absolutely nothing. He left the house before 6 o'clock in the morning, when his daughter hadn't woken yet, and returned after 9 o'clock at night, when the little girl was already asleep. His world during those weeks was thick with shipments and meetings, until the first Saturday afternoon in nearly 2 months when he came home early, at 4 o'clock, with the mansion flooded in autumn sunlight. He crossed the foyer with a folder of documents in his hand, intending to go straight up to his study, then stopped halfway on the staircase. Because there was a sound drifting through the air of this house, a sound completely wrong against the map of silence he had memorized for 3 years, the sound of a child laughing. He stood motionless for several seconds, his hand tightening around the banister, then followed that sound like a sleepwalker through the east wing corridor to the door of the playroom, which had been left slightly open, and what he saw through the crack nailed him to the floor. His daughter was sitting in the middle of the rug, facing the new maid, between them a towering puzzle castle built high and crooked, and Bianca, the child he had carried through 11 clinics in 3 states, was holding the final piece, placing it on top of the tower, turning toward the maid and saying in a clear, bright voice, "All done, Della. Look, is it tall?" And then the little girl laughed, a crisp burst of laughter running down the hallway and drilling straight through the chest of the man standing behind the door. Massimo didn't go in. That was the strangest thing. Something even later he couldn't explain. The man who had never hesitated before any door in this city didn't dare push open a child's door already left ajar. He stood there listening to his daughter talk, counting 14 words in 3 minutes. 14 words, more than the total number he had heard from her in 3 years. And inside his chest, 3 streams of lava erupted at once. Impossible to separate, a gratitude so fierce he wanted to fall to his knees, an ugly jealousy toward the strange woman who was receiving the thing he, the child's own father, had begged heaven and earth for 3 years, and never received. And over all of it, shame, sharp as a knife, because his daughter's voice had come back weeks ago, right beneath his own roof, and he hadn't known, because he hadn't been here, because he had never truly been here. He left the door without making a sound, and only 3 days later did he summon Delilah to his study. 3 days for the ice to close over just enough for him to do what he did best, turn emotion into a transaction. Delilah stepped into the room she had never been allowed to enter. Dark wood, leather, bookshelves rising to the ceiling, and the man seated behind the desk did not invite her to sit. He went straight to the point in the voice of the boardroom. "I'm told my daughter has begun speaking again, and that the person she speaks with is you." "Yes, sir." "Since when?" Delilah answered honestly. "For more than 5 weeks, sir," and she saw his jaw tighten when that number fell onto the desk. 5 weeks, 35 days he hadn't known. He opened a drawer, placed a thick envelope on the desk, and pushed it toward her, his voice still flat as the surface of a frozen lake. "There are $20,000 in here, 10,000 for what you've done for the child, and 10,000 for your discretion. What happens inside this house, my daughter's condition, is not to become anyone's story beyond that gate. Do you understand?" The room fell silent for 3 seconds, and then Delilah did something no one had ever done in that room before. She stepped forward, opened the envelope in front of him, counted the money cleanly into 2 parts with her rough hands, and the efficient movements of someone who had once counted every dollar in order to survive, then placed half of it back on the desk, pushed it toward him, and lifted her eyes straight to his, without lowering them, exactly as she had done that day in the foyer. "Sir, I'll accept 10,000 for the work, because I worked and I did the work well, but I won't accept money for silence. My silence is not merchandise. I don't keep the little girl's story inside this house because I'm being paid to. I keep it because of who I am, and if you need to pay money to buy that, then it means you believe that one day I could sell it. I don't want to work in a house where the master believes that about me." Massimo Falcone, the man who had once made men half again his size turn pale simply by setting a pen down on a table, sat there in silence, looking at the half envelope of money pushed back in front of him. And for the first time in many years, he had no answer ready. Because in his world everything had a price, loyalty had a price, silence had the highest price of all. His entire life had been built on that price list, and yet this woman, the woman whose personnel file told him she carried a debt of $90,000, had just pushed $10,000 in cash back across the desk, simply to keep hold of something no one could see. He looked at her for a long while, and in those dark brown eyes, something shifted very softly, like the first crack of ice beneath the surface of a lake frozen solid for far too long. Then he gave a single nod, drew the envelope back, and said exactly 4 words, his voice still level, but altered by a degree of warmth he himself had not yet recognized. "I understand, Miss Quinn." Delilah gave a proper bow of her head and turned to leave, but when her hand closed around the door handle, his voice sounded behind her, lower, slower, and this time it was no longer the voice of the boardroom. "Miss Quinn. The child, when she laughs, does she sound like—" He stopped, the question breaking halfway through, and Delilah, without turning around, understood that there were some questions people couldn't manage to ask in full. She answered toward the wooden door in front of her, her voice as gentle as placing a candy on the lid of a bucket. "She laughs very much like someone this whole house is missing, sir." Then she opened the door and stepped out, closing it behind her, leaving the most powerful man in Chicago, sitting alone in the dark woodroom, with an envelope of money no one had been willing to accept in full, and an answer that made him turn his chair toward the window, where autumn sunlight was falling over the garden, so no one, not even the walls, could see his face in that moment. After the conversation in the study, small changes began slipping into the rhythm of the mansion, changes only someone as sharp-eyed as Mrs. Brennan could have named. The master's return time gradually moved from 9 o'clock at night to 7, then some days to 6. The familiar black car rolling through the gate before the sunlight had even faded, and Massimo began a new habit. He did not enter the playroom, not once, but he would slow down when he passed that door, sometimes stopping altogether at the end of the hallway, with a folder of documents in his hand, listening to his daughter chatter to Della about the colors of the puzzle pieces, and Mrs. Brennan realized that her master had begun reading documents in the chair, in the second-floor reading room, instead of inside his closed study, a chair that just happened to be positioned where he could hear the laughter from the end of the hallway. Meanwhile, Delilah and Bianca's world grew wider by the day, spreading from the playroom into the garden, where the two of them collected red maple leaves and pressed them into an old notebook, spreading down into the kitchen, where Bianca was given the solemn duty of sprinkling flour onto a baking tray, and also sprinkling it all over Della's hair. And it was during those peaceful days that Delilah began thinking about something people who grew up gently never had to think about. She knew from her own hard childhood that the most precious thing an adult could give a child was not protection from every fear, but a specific thing to do when fear came rushing in, because a child who had something to do would not turn to stone. She thought about it even more when she noticed that Bianca had nameless fears of her own. The little girl startled violently when November thunder made the windows shake. She stood rooted in place when an ambulance siren screamed outside on the street. Those moments when her brown eyes went empty for a few seconds, as though she were looking into someplace very far away. And Delilah did not ask, did not analyze. She simply decided to turn what she wanted to teach into the only thing a 4-year-old child could truly absorb, a game. The game was born one Thursday afternoon on the playroom rug, with the stuffed rabbit as the main character. Delilah solemnly announced that Bunny was going to learn how to become a knight today, and knights had to know the rules of the castle. Rule number 1, when something frightened Bunny, Bunny did not stand frozen in the middle of the hall. Bunny ran to his watchtower, and the watchtower was the nearest room with a lock that could be turned. Like this reading room, see, we turn the little round button on the doorknob like this, and the dragon can't get in. Bianca tried turning the lock with both hands, her eyes wide when she heard the click, and Delilah nodded, as though she had just witnessed a knighting ceremony. Rule number 2 was taught the next day. When Delilah held in her hand the sky blue children's watch, she had suggested Mrs. Brennan buy for the little girl. The kind of tracking watch American families often used for children, with a round face printed like the night sky, and on the side there was a raised yellow button shaped like a 5-pointed star. She fastened it around Bianca's tiny wrist and lowered her voice to a whisper, as though revealing a secret of the kingdom. This is the magic star. Do you know what the magic star does? When the knight is already in the watchtower and still feels scared, the knight presses this star, holds it tight like this, and do you know who will hear it? Guess. The little girl tilted her head and thought for a long time, then whispered, Della. Delilah smiled, shook her head, and pointed skyward with the utmost solemnity. Even higher than that. This star calls straight to the strongest person in the kingdom. It calls your father. Wherever your father is, he'll hear it. This is the strongest magic in this castle, so we don't use it carelessly. We only use it when Bunny is truly afraid. Remember that night? The first practice drill took place on Sunday afternoon and entered the mansion's history as an event everyone remembered without anyone needing to say so. Delilah played the dragon with a blanket draped over her shoulders as wings, growling as she circled the playroom. Bianca shrieked with laughter, then scrambled as fast as her little legs could carry her toward the reading room, her small hands working hard to turn the lock with a click, and from behind the door came the sound of the little girl panting as she pressed the button. On the other side of the city, in the middle of a Sunday afternoon meeting at the harbor office, Massimo Falcone's phone lit up with a call from the device bearing his daughter's name. He shot up from his chair so fast that the swivel chair struck the wall behind him, pressed the phone to his ear, and heard his daughter's breathless, excited voice. Papa, I'm a knight. I hid from the dragon, in the watchtower. The star really called you. Della, it really called him. And the man who had just ordered an 8-figure deal frozen stood in the middle of his office, one hand braced on the edge of the desk, listening to his daughter's laughter mixed with the sound of the defeated dragon in the distance. It took him several seconds to find his voice, a voice the 12 people in that meeting room had never heard before. I hear you, sweetheart. Well done, Knight. Papa always hears you. That evening he came home at 5:30, earlier than any previous record, and the following Sunday morning, for the first time in 3 years, the small dining room beside the kitchen, the warm room Katerina had once preferred over the grand dining room, was lit again. Massimo sat reading the paper with a cup of coffee. Bianca knelt on a chair directing the cinnamon sprinkling on the pancakes, while Delilah stood by the stove in the role of a cook, being criticized by both father and daughter for not sprinkling the cinnamon generously enough. And there was one very brief moment when Bianca clutched her father's sleeve with her right hand, and Della's dress with her left to drag them both over, to see the stack of pancakes leaning like the Tower of Pisa. A moment when 3 people stood gathered around the sunlit kitchen table, laughter, overlapping laughter, and anyone looking through that window from the garden would have sworn they were seeing a family. Delilah was the first to remind herself. She quietly stepped back half a pace toward the stove, into the proper place of an employee. But that half step was not far enough to keep her from hearing Bianca ask her father, in a whispering voice she thought was secret, though the whole kitchen could hear, Papa, next Sunday can we have breakfast like this again? With Della too, and it was not far enough to keep her from seeing the most powerful man in Chicago nod to his daughter, with a slow, certain nod, as though signing an agreement more important than any contract in his life. Yes, with Della too. Those warm Sunday mornings lasted through nearly the whole winter, and then spring brought to the Falcone mansion, something no one in the servants' wing had foreseen, though perhaps they should have, because the rumors had been murmuring for months now. The master had a woman. It began 8 months before the climax of everything that was about to unfold, at the children's charity auction at the Drake Hotel, where Massimo had come out of obligation and intended to leave after 30 minutes, but then stayed because of a woman in a deep blue silk dress standing in front of the painting he had just won at auction, a woman who either did not know who he was or pretended not to. and remarked to him that the person who bought this piece either understood art very well or was very lonely, usually both, and when he asked which side she belonged to, she looked at him over the rim of her wineglass and answered, "I belong to the side that can see that." 8 months after that night, a diamond ring was on the hand of the woman in the blue silk dress, and on a Saturday morning in early April, 3 cars loaded with leather suitcases stopped before the steps of the mansion. Vanessa Sterling officially moved into the house she would become mistress of in only a few more months. To be fair, and Delilah herself would later have to admit this, Vanessa's introduction before the entire household staff was a masterpiece. She did not arrive like a new mistress. She arrived like a grateful guest. She asked Mrs. Brennan to gather everyone in the foyer not so she could lecture them, but so she could shake every hand herself, ask every name, compliment the gardener on the rose bushes, ask the cook about the risotto recipe she swore was the best she had ever eaten, and when it was Delilah's turn, Vanessa took her hand in both of her soft hands, scented faintly with French perfume, tilted her head with a smile warm as April sunlight, and said she had heard so much about her, that she was the golden hands of this house, and that she hoped the two of them would get along well. The servant's wing nearly melted. The cook whispered that the master was fortunate. The gardener nodded and said this house needed a woman like that. Even iron-willed Mrs. Brennan had to admit Miss Sterling had been perfectly educated. Only Delilah, standing at the end of the line with her hands still warmed by that woman's touch, carried inside her a feeling she could not name. It was not suspicion, not then. Only a small note that her old instinct saved without asking permission. That throughout the 20-minute greeting with 11 servants, Miss Sterling had asked everyone about their work, about food, about the garden, but not once, not even in passing politeness, had she asked about the 4-year-old girl living in the house whose stepmother she was about to become. And the second note, thin as a strand of hair, was that when Vanessa held her hand and said she had heard so much about her, for 1/100th of a second, those green eyes did not rest on Delilah's face, but slipped downward, assessing, measuring, the kind of glance Delilah had seen 1,000 times in her life from people looking at her to decide whether she was the sort worth noticing, before that April smile closed over everything, as if nothing had ever happened. As for Massimo, it had to be said that during those months he lived like a man newly pardoned. 10 years in his world had left no room for softness. 3 years of widowhood had turned the house into a tomb, and now, all at once, he had both his daughter's voice and the warmth of a woman returned to him. Fate, after taking so much from him, seemed to be giving everything back in a single season. Vanessa understood the art he collected, the wine he drank, even his silences, and she never asked about his work. She appeared beside him with exactly the right splendor, at events where she needed to appear, vanished with graceful timing when he needed to be alone, and she said to him the sentences every lonely man longed to hear, like the one she said on her first evening after moving in. When the two of them stood on the balcony overlooking the garden, "I don't need to know who you are out there. I only need to know who you are when you're here." He fell into the trap not because he was foolish. Foolish men did not survive to 37 in his world. He fell into the trap because it had been crafted specifically for him, measured and cut to fit his loneliness exactly, and because happiness, a stranger to him for far too long, did what it always did to even the smartest men, it made him want to believe. And a person who wants to believe willingly goes blind. Vanessa's first week in the mansion passed as smoothly as silk. She did not change anything too quickly, only suggested a few small things so reasonable that no one found anything worth discussing. She asked permission to use the greenhouse at the corner of the garden as a place to read in the afternoon, because she needed a private corner where she wouldn't disturb the household routine. What no one realized was that she had quietly mapped out the guard rotations and found a way to temporarily freeze the local camera feeds whenever she stepped inside. She suggested changing the cleaning schedule for the master bedroom to the morning, because she often rested in the afternoon. They were all the requests of a considerate woman, and on the first Wednesday afternoon, when Delilah carried a basket of laundry out to the drying area behind the house, she saw from a distance the image that would become familiar in the months to come, Vanessa sitting in the greenhouse among the orchids, her legs crossed elegantly, an open book resting on her lap, and a phone pressed to her ear. She spoke on the phone for quite a long time. The book did not turn a single page, but what was strange about that? Everyone had long phone calls. Delilah finished hanging the laundry and reminded herself of Mrs. Brennan's spell. Let everything pass through the ears like water through a basket. She bent down to lift the empty basket, and when she looked up one last time before going inside, she caught the exact moment Vanessa inside the greenhouse was looking in her direction too. Nearly 100 feet and 2 layers of glass stood between them, too far to read her expression, only close enough for Delilah to know one thing for certain. That woman had stopped talking on the phone at some point, and was watching her hang the laundry. The mask fell for the first time on a Monday morning in mid-April, less than 2 weeks after the day the 3 cars loaded with leather suitcases stopped before the front steps. That morning, Vanessa came downstairs to see Massimo off to work. She stood on the steps in a cream-colored silk robe, straightened his tie, kissed his cheek, and waved after the convoy with a smile warm enough to melt the morning mist. And Delilah, who was cleaning the tall panes of glass in the front foyer not far away, witnessed in full a phenomenon she would later see repeated so many times she could almost set a clock by it. The last car of the convoy had barely disappeared beyond the iron gate when the smile on Vanessa's face snapped off as though someone had flipped a switch. It did not slowly fade, did not soften away. It went out. Her shoulders loosened from that graceful posture. Her jaw hardened, and the woman who turned back into the house then was someone else entirely. She walked past Delilah without a glance and dropped a voice. Delilah had never heard from her before, flat, cold, sharp as a paper cutter. The glass is still stained in that corner. Where are your eyes? From that day on, the servants' wing began to learn that this mansion now had 2 time zones. The time zone when the master was home, when Miss Sterling sweetly asked after everyone, and thanked them for every small task, and the time zone when the master was away, when orders fell without needing a subject, when the cook had an entire lunch tray sent back with a message through the house phone saying, "I can't swallow this, make it again," when the gardener was forced to dig up and replant an entire bed of white roses because white looked like a funeral, and when Mrs. Brennan, who had served this house for 40 years, was summoned into the parlor to hear that the way she folded napkins had been outdated since the 1990s. No one told the master, of course. The law of silence in the house operated exactly as it had been designed to, and Vanessa understood that. She operated her 2 faces with the precision of someone who knew that law even better than the servants did. For Delilah, she reserved a separate treatment. She did not shout at her as she did with the others, but offered something colder. Vanessa looked at her the way people looked at a stain on an expensive rug, not with anger, only with a quiet, simmering irritation that it existed, and now and then she dropped careless questions with hooks hidden inside them. "I hear Mr. Falcone values you very much. A servant being valued by the master is a blessing, isn't it?" Or, "The pay here must be good, surely, because how could anyone carry that much debt and still look so calm?" Those sentences told Delilah that this woman had read her personnel file, knew about the $90,000 debt, and wanted Delilah to know that she knew. Delilah swallowed all of it, lowered her head, and answered "Yes, Mom," exactly as she was supposed to, because she had finished doing her own calculation long ago. This job was the only road out of the yellow envelope, and a person starving to death didn't have the right to pride. But there was one thing she couldn't swallow, not because it was aimed at her, but because it was aimed at someone who did not know how to defend herself. Bianca, the child who had chattered all through the winter, began to change according to a pattern Delilah recognized after exactly 3 observations. The little girl still spoke and laughed normally with her father, with Mrs. Brennan, but as soon as Vanessa entered the room, even just to pick up a magazine, every sound from the child shut off at once. She did not cry, did not run away, only went silent and shrank in on herself like a snail retreating into its shell, her eyes fixed on the puzzle pieces, her small shoulders folding inward, and she would remain that way until the other woman left, sometimes even longer. Vanessa had never done anything to the child. That was what made everything impossible to name. She did not yell, did not punish her, even asked Bianca gently in front of Massimo what she had played with that day. But Delilah, who had spent her whole childhood reading the air in a house, before she could even read words, knew that children were the most sensitive creatures in the world to one thing, whether or not they were welcome. No one taught them. They simply knew, the way birds know a storm, and Bianca's silence before Vanessa was the most accurate weather report in this house. The tragedy was that Massimo read that report with the fear of a father instead of the eyes of a boss. He saw only his daughter, the child who had been alive again for less than half a year, slipping back into silence more and more often. At dinners where Vanessa was present, the little girl did not say a single word, and the old panic returned and closed its hand around him. His child's illness was coming back. The miracle was expiring. And Vanessa was there, at the exact right time, in the exact right role, to catch that panic with the softest hands. "I've done some research, darling," she said one evening in late May, her voice weighted with just the right degree of sorrow. "Cases like Bianca's need a specialized therapeutic environment. There's a boarding school in Connecticut, the best in the country for traumatized children. They have speech therapists with the children 24 hours a day. I know it hurts to hear, but are we keeping her here because we need her, or because she needs us? You have to ask yourself that honestly." And Delilah, who was clearing glasses in the next room with the door ajar, heard every word, heard the long silence from Massimo afterward too. The silence of a man who was truly considering it, and she stood there among the crystal glasses, her hands clenched so tightly around the tray that her knuckles turned white, understanding for the first time the true shape of the chessboard. That woman did not need to beat or shout at anyone. She only needed to be gentle, patient, and move one piece at a time, removing from the board every piece that stood between her and that man. And the first piece she wanted to remove, wrapped in paper labeled love, and in the name of what was best for the child, was the 4-year-old girl who had only just learned again how to call out, "Papa." The proposal about the school in Connecticut had not yet been decided. Massimo said he needed time to think, and it was during that stretch of thinking by the master of the house that Delilah began to notice the existence of the man in the gray coat. The first time was on a Tuesday afternoon in early June. She was cutting roses along the narrow path running beside the greenhouse, a task Mrs. Brennan assigned her twice every week to keep fresh flowers in the rooms, when she heard the soft grind of tires over gravel on the service drive behind the garden, the entrance meant for suppliers, where cars rarely came at that hour. A gray sedan stopped there, and the man who stepped out was around 45, thin, with a sharp-angled face as if it had been carved with an axe, wearing a heavy gray coat despite the June weather. He did not ring the bell, did not ask for anyone, simply walked straight through the garden toward the greenhouse, as though he knew the way. And through the panes of glass flashing with sunlight, Delilah saw that Vanessa was already seated inside among the orchids, holding a small signal jammer in her hand, looking not at all surprised. She knew the security room would only see a looped, empty screen for the next half hour. The meeting lasted about 20 minutes. Delilah finished cutting her basket of flowers and went inside, telling herself that a guest of the future mistress of the house had nothing to do with her. Water through a basket, but her instinct had already taken several photographs without needing a camera. The man had brought no flowers, no gift, none of the things people brought when visiting a lady soon to be married. He carried a large brown envelope, and when he left, the envelope was no longer in his hand. The second time came exactly 8 days after the first, again on a Tuesday, again the gray sedan. And this time Delilah noticed another detail that made the back of her neck turn cold, even though June sunlight was falling over her shoulders. It was the afternoon Massimo had flown to Detroit for a meeting with his partners, a schedule the entire household had been told about 3 days earlier. She remembered the first meeting, too, which had also taken place on a day when the master was away the whole afternoon at Commercial Court. Twice is not yet a pattern, her mother used to say when teaching her how to read people. Twice is coincidence, 3 times is a road, and Delilah decided not to conclude anything, only to remember. But that night, lying in the small room overlooking the rose garden, she did something she herself had to question for a long time before doing. She took from the bottom of her canvas bag the old brown leather notebook, the only thing left of her mother, its pages dense with her mother's handwriting from the final years, recording medicine schedules, doctor's appointments, every expense down to the dollar, and on the blank pages left at the back, Delilah began writing the first lines of her own. No accusation, no speculation, only bare facts in the exact way her mother had kept track of debts. Tuesday, June 3rd, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Male guest in gray coat, gray sedan, met Miss S in greenhouse 20 minutes. Brought brown envelope, Mr. F away from home. Tuesday, June 11th, 3:30 in the afternoon, same guest, same location. Mr. F in Detroit. When she finished writing, she read it over and defended herself to herself in the dark. This was not gossip. This was the habit of someone life had taught that when the time came, memory was not enough. There had to be black ink on white paper. Then she slipped the notebook into the space between the mattress and the bed skirt, where from then on it would lie still like a seed waiting for its season. The third time, the road appeared exactly as her mother had said it. Again Tuesday, again late afternoon, again on the same day Massimo was occupied all afternoon at a signing ceremony downtown. And this time fate, or something more merciless than fate, arranged for Delilah to hear the first broken fragments. She was cutting flowers on the narrow path beside the greenhouse on her usual schedule. The vent window above her head had been left slightly open by someone because of the early summer heat, and the voices inside drifted out with the moving air, broken, rising and sinking, no sentence whole. The man's voice was low and dry, like the sound of paper being turned, several words falling in pieces onto the flower path, impatient. Higher up asking about progress, then Vanessa's voice. The voice of the time zone without the master that Delilah had come to know, cold and clipped. Tell them it's on schedule. No one interferes. The man's voice dropped a few more fragments, documents, must be finished before, and Vanessa, clearest of everything that escaped that afternoon, as though she had grown annoyed enough to forget to lower her voice, said, "How many times have I told you? Paperwork first, wedding first, everything else after. Get the order wrong by one step and the whole board is ruined." The shears in Delilah's hand stopped in midair for exactly 2 seconds, then continued cutting. Snip, one rose fell into the basket. Snip, another one. She forced herself to keep the rhythm of a gardener who had heard nothing, her heart pounding all the way up into her ears while her hands remained steady, because she understood with the instinct of someone who had survived too many things that the most dangerous moment for an eavesdropper was not the moment of hearing, but the moment of forgetting to keep playing her role. She cut flowers until the basket was full, rose leisurely to her feet, brushed the soil from her knees, and walked into the house with the steps of an ordinary afternoon. That night, the brown notebook was pulled once more from the space beside the mattress, and beneath the light of the small table lamp, Delilah sat for a long time before the page, the pen hovering, because she was fully aware of the line she was about to cross. The first 2 entries were records of the eye. This line would be a record of the ear, the thing Mrs. Brennan called the most dangerous part of a servant's body. She thought of the $90,000 of debt, thought of the warm little room and the salary no other place would ever pay, thought of her mother's instruction about water passing through a basket. But then she thought of that evening among the crystal glasses, of the boarding school in Connecticut, of the child who had placed candy on the lid of her bucket, and the pen lowered. Tuesday, June 17th, 3:45 in the afternoon, heard through greenhouse vent, Miss S.'s voice, exact words, paperwork first, wedding first, everything else after. When she finished writing, she blew the ink dry, closed the notebook, and sat motionless in the small room for a long while, both hands resting on the brown leather cover, as though resting on an object that had suddenly become much heavier than its true weight. Outside the window, the rose garden was sinking slowly into darkness, and at the farthest corner of the garden, the glass frame of the greenhouse caught the last of the sunset, flashing a deep red, like an eye that had just blinked. If there was one person in the world Massimo Falcone trusted without needing to think, it was not Vanessa, not even Polly, but Warren Hale. 48 years old, with silver hair at both temples in the exact style of gentlemen in Swiss watch advertisements, Hale had stood beside the Falcone family for a full 20 years, since the time Massimo's father was still in power. It was Hale who drafted the old man's will. It was Hale who carried Massimo through 3 federal tax investigations without so much as a hair out of place. It was Hale who stood beside him in the cemetery on the day of Katerina's funeral, one hand resting on his shoulder without saying a single unnecessary word. And in a world where loyalty was weighed and measured every day, Warren Hale was the standard unit of measurement. People in that circle still said that if Hale ever left the Falcone family, it would mean the sky had fallen. So on a Thursday morning in late June, when Hale came to the mansion with his familiar leather briefcase and said, There were several important matters to discuss before the wedding. Massimo received him in the study with Italian-style coffee and the ease of a man preparing to speak with the right hand of his entire life. Hale spread the files across the desk in his usual manner, coherent, dry, precise as surgery. Massimo, I'm telling you this as your lawyer and as the man who helped bury your father. The situation now is different from 3 years ago. The Federal Organized Crime Task Force is tightening around the families on the East Coast. 2 houses in New Jersey just had all their assets frozen under the RICO Act overnight. Accounts, real estate, even the yacht was sealed. Their wives and children had to move into hotels, and after the wedding, you'll have one more weakness prosecutors love to exploit: a new wife with no legal shielding. Hale's solution was presented over 40 minutes with diagrams that would have made any law professor nod in approval. A prenuptial agreement to protect both parties' separate assets, standard for any marriage involving major wealth in America, a family trust holding the clean assets, houses, legitimate logistics companies, so that if some bad day came and the federal government knocked on the door, what belonged to Bianca and to the new wife would remain beyond the reach of a freeze order, and finally, a limited power of attorney allowing the designated person to manage the trust's assets if Massimo were arrested, incapacitated, or simply had to disappear for a while. You remember the Moran case, Hale said, tapping one finger lightly on the file. The boss was detained for only 6 weeks, and the whole empire froze, because no one had authority to sign a single check. I won't allow that to happen to the Falcone house. The most reasonable signing date is right before the wedding, so every legal effect is tied to the marital status. I propose Friday afternoon, 1 day before the ceremony, here, with a notary I'll bring. Everything was reasonable down to the last comma, and that was the most frightening thing that no one in that room saw that day, not even the smartest man in Chicago, because that reasonableness had been built from real material. The RICO Act was real. Asset freezes were real. Hale's concern sounded as if it had been cast from 20 years of devotion. That evening, over a candlelit dinner in the small dining room, Vanessa completed her part with a touch so light it almost didn't exist. She did not ask about the files, did not mention the words power of attorney. She only said that this afternoon she had read the article about the family in New Jersey, how the wife had to leave the house within 24 hours with only a suitcase of clothes, and that she kept thinking, women who marry great men like you, it turns out what they need is not a large ring, but the certainty that their children will never have to drag a suitcase to a hotel in the middle of the night. Then she changed the subject to wedding flowers, as lightly as turning the page of a magazine, and Massimo sat there, looking at the woman who would soon become his wife, worrying about his daughter, feeling the decision inside him tighten another turn without anyone needing to twist it. The only person twisting in the opposite direction was Paulie Russo. The next morning, in the car on the way to the harbor, Paulie listened as Massimo described the plan and did what he had done through 30 years of service. He told the truth. Boss, I don't have a law degree. I only have a nose. And my nose says that paperwork giving another person authority to manage things is still giving away authority, no matter what reason it's wrapped in. Your father had one rule back then. A signature is blood. Don't sign anything within the first year of any relationship. I'm not saying Miss Sterling has a problem. I'm saying the sequence has a problem. Why not marry first, live together for a year, then sign whatever needs signing? Massimo looked through the car window for a while, then answered in a calm voice with a sharp edge along the sentence. The sequence was set by Warren. He buried my father. He kept this house standing through 3 investigations. When your nose outweighs Warren Hale's 20-year record, we'll continue this conversation. And one more thing, Paulie. You just said you're not saying Miss Sterling has a problem. But every word you said was saying exactly that. I'm about to marry that woman. I need the people around me to understand that. The car drove another 2 miles in silence. Paulie looked over at the man he had held in his arms since he was a child, and for the first time in 30 years, he chose not to say the next sentence already waiting on the tip of his tongue. He only gave a faint nod. Understood, boss. Then he turned away and watched the gray warehouses slide past the window, while Massimo, the man who had just won the argument, sat there with a vague discomfort he could not place. The feeling of someone who had closed a door without checking whether anyone was standing on the other side. The schedule was finalized that very afternoon through Hale's office. The signing of the documents, the prenuptial agreement, the trust, and the power of attorney was set for 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon in the mansion study, exactly 1 day before the wedding, and when Mrs. Brennan wrote the schedule for the great week on the board in the kitchen so the entire household staff could keep track of it, Delilah stood before that board a little longer than everyone else, her eyes fixed on the line that read Friday afternoon, document signing, 3 o'clock, and in her mind, uninvited, the sentence lying inside the brown notebook beneath her mattress rang out word for word: paperwork first, wedding first, everything else after. The schedule board in the kitchen counted down day by day toward the wedding, and every night Delilah lay there listening to the brown notebook beneath her mattress, as though listening to a second heart beating in the dark. 3 lines, a chain of coincidences, one sentence that had slipped through a ventilation crack, placed side by side. They drew a shape she did not dare name, but taken separately, each piece could still be harmless. A guest of the future mistress of the house, an envelope of documents, a remark about wedding paperwork, because who didn't have paperwork before a wedding? And it was that suspended space between the 2 interpretations that tortured her, because she knew the law of this house. Here, a servant who accused the mistress without proof would not be fired in the ordinary way. People did not write recommendation letters for loose tongues in the Falcone world. They only made those tongues disappear from conversations, and she had only one person left in this world to think about, herself. But then Saturday came, and while cleaning the playroom, she heard Bianca arranging her puzzle pieces and whispering to the stuffed rabbit in that clear voice, unaware she was being heard. "Bunny, don't be scared. If you go to the faraway school, Della and Papa will be there too." And Delilah stood still in the room, understanding that the little girl had heard fragments about Connecticut from somewhere, had wrapped her fear inside the rabbit, and her heart handed down the final verdict in place of reason. On Sunday night, she stood before the study door for the first time. She had practiced the opening sentence all afternoon, "Sir, I need to tell you something that may cost me my job." But when the wooden door opened after her knock, and Massimo looked up from the desk buried in documents, his eyes hollowed by the long nights before the wedding, his voice came first. "Is something wrong, Miss Quinn?" And everything she had practiced turned to smoke, because she saw on his desk the trial wedding photograph of the 2 of them taken the week before, saw the man who had only just come back to life after 3 years standing in the middle of the happiest week of his life, and the question burst inside her head like a bucket of cold water. What are you going to say? That his future wife receives guests in the greenhouse, that you overheard one sentence about paperwork, you, the indebted maid carrying $90,000 of debt that she already knows all about, who will believe you? And when her voice came out, it had changed course on its own halfway there. "Sir, the kitchen expense ledger for this month needs your approval signature. Mrs. Brennan told me to bring it up." Massimo signed without reading, nodded, and the door closed behind her along with the first chance. She cursed herself for 2 days, and by Tuesday night, after witnessing yet another dinner, where Bianca sat silent as a statue beside Vanessa, while Vanessa gently served food to the child in front of her father, Delilah decided there would be no expense ledger this time. She knocked, stepped inside, and spoke at once before her courage could run away again. "Sir, may I say something? I may have seen it wrong, but I think you should know. For the past few weeks, there has been a man in a gray coat, driving a gray sedan, coming to meet Miss Sterling in the greenhouse several times, always when you are away from home. I work beside the flower-cutting path there, so I happened to see it." I thought, but her sentence never reached its destination, because Massimo had set down his pen, and the way he placed that pen on the desk, light, slow, exact, changed the temperature of the room in the same way the 12 men at the harbor had once witnessed. He sat straighter, looking at her with eyes that had closed every door that had begun to open over the past few months. And when he spoke, his voice was not 1 decibel louder than an ordinary man's, but it was so cold she felt it on her skin. "The man in the gray coat is named Doyle. He works for the event company handling security for the wedding. The guest list for this wedding includes people the whole country would like to photograph in secret. The fact that she meets him discreetly is at my request. Now, Miss Quinn, I will say this exactly once. You have done good for my daughter, so this conversation ends here and will never be mentioned again." But if you ever bring me another one of your observations about my fiancée, her meetings, or your thoughts about her, then no matter who you are to Bianca, you will leave this house that same day. Servants in this house do not watch their employers. That law is older than I am, do you understand? And Delilah, standing in the dark wood room with both hands clasped tightly behind her back, had only enough voice left to say, "Yes, sir, I understand," then stepped out and closed the door, leaning back against the hallway wall for several seconds, not because of the threat, but because she had just seen the depth of the abyss. The explanation about Doyle had been too smooth, too reasonable, which meant Vanessa had fenced off even this road long ago. That night was too humid to sleep. Near 11 o'clock, Delilah went down to the kitchen for a glass of water, and through the kitchen window, she saw the greenhouse light still on, a lone yellow streak at the end of the garden. She did not intend to do anything at all. She swore that to herself, as she opened the back door and stepped onto the porch for a breath of night air. But her feet carried her along the familiar flower-cutting path, as they did on every work afternoon, through darkness black as ink, with only the sound of crickets and the scent of night roses. And from the ventilation crack, still left open because of the heat, Vanessa's voice drifted out into the stillness, no longer broken this time because there was no wind at night. She was speaking on the phone, her voice low-clipped and terrifyingly calm. "I know what I'm doing. You just make sure your part stays clean. Every route has been checked. No cameras, no witnesses. Once the signing is done Friday, everything will be in position. Leave the rest to me." Then, after a pause while the person on the other end spoke, Vanessa let out a short dry laugh, without a single ounce of warmth, and said the sentence that nailed Delilah to the ground among the rose bushes. "You worry too much." However smoothly it went 3 years ago, it will go just as smoothly this time. History will repeat itself just like 3 years ago. The only difference is that this time, after the accident, everything will already be in my hands on paper. The glass of water in Delilah's hand was ice cold, but sweat broke across her palm. 3 years ago, those words fell, and every loose piece inside the brown notebook automatically locked together into a shape with a name. The accident 3 years ago, the dead wife, the child who stopped speaking, and history about to repeat itself with the man who had warned her tonight. She stepped backward out of the flower path without a sound, her heart pounding, as if it might break through her ribs, returned to her room, sat down on the edge of the bed in the dark, and knew the boundary was behind her now. There was no way back. Tomorrow morning, even if she had to kneel in the middle of that study, even if he threw her out through the gate at once, she would tell him everything, all of it, from the brown envelope to the sentence tonight, because some silences were golden, and some silences were complicity in a funeral being scheduled. She pulled the brown notebook from the crack beside the mattress and wrote the final line in trembling handwriting. Wednesday, July 16th, 11 o'clock at night. Heard at the greenhouse. Exact words. History will repeat itself just like 3 years ago. Then she held the notebook against her chest and sat awake waiting for morning, not knowing that in the greenhouse at the end of the garden, the phone call had ended long ago. The light had gone out, but the woman inside had still not left. Dawn came at 5:40, and Delilah had already put on her cleanest uniform, her hair pinned into a neat bun, the brown notebook tucked into the front pocket of her apron, close to her heart. Through the sleepless night, she had decided on the order of things. Wait for the master to come down for his morning coffee at 6:30, as usual. Ask for 5 minutes before he left the house, and begin at the beginning, with the first brown envelope. But at 6:15, as she was stepping down the servants' staircase, that plan died on the 3rd step. Because in the service foyer below, 3 men from the security team were already waiting, not the 2 familiar gate guards, but Rick Muller's team, the mansion's head of security, a man with a neck as thick as a tree trunk whom the staff only ever saw when something had happened. And Muller looked up at her with the eyes of a man looking at an object that needed to be moved. "Miss Quinn, stay where you are. There has been an allegation of missing property in the house. By procedure, we're searching the servants' quarters, starting with your room." Delilah stood on the stairs, and in that split second, the mind that had been tempered by a whole life of storms ran faster than fear. A search this morning, the morning she meant to say everything, not coincidence. There was no coincidence in the world that fit so perfectly, and she heard her own voice come out with a calm so strange it almost seemed to belong to someone else. Yes, of course. I have nothing to hide. The sentence was true. The only thing was that she did not yet know her room did. The search lasted 11 minutes. The entire servants' wing had been called awake and made to stand along the hallway as witnesses under procedure. The cook still heavy-eyed with sleep, the gardener with his arms crossed, Mrs. Brennan standing straight as a ruler with an unreadable face, and Delilah standing among them, watching two men lift the mattress from her bed and open every drawer in her cabinet, and she only had time to silently thank heaven that the brown notebook was in the apron pocket against her chest and not beneath that mattress. Then the third man's voice rang out from the corner of the room, near the small wardrobe. "Chief, I've got something." Time in the hallway thickened when the security man stepped out, in one hand holding Delilah's old shoebox. Inside the box were not the winter shoes she had stored away, but neat stacks of cash and $100 bills bound with rubber bands. Later she would hear the amount was $15,000. In his other hand, the man held a small black object the size of a matchbox, a digital voice recorder, the kind activated by sound. Muller picked up the recorder, examined it, pressed a button, and in that crowded hallway, from the tiny speaker, Massimo Falcone's voice came through clearly as he discussed business over the phone, sentences, figures, names that were never supposed to leave his study. No one said anything for the first 3 seconds, and that silence spoke louder than any accusation. Delilah looked around at the faces of the people she had worked and eaten beside for nearly a year. Cook raised a hand to cover her mouth. The gardener turned his face away. Eyes that had been warm only yesterday, now all changed into the look Delilah knew by heart from the years of debt collectors, the look reserved for someone already condemned. Only Mrs. Brennan was still looking straight at her for a long time, and in the 60-year-old woman's eyes there was no contempt, only a silent question and a bottomless sorrow. Delilah did not scream, did not collapse, did not grab anyone's hand and swear her innocence. People who set traps expected that. Tears and panic were the most beautiful confession in the eyes of a crowd. Instead, she stood straight, both hands at her sides, and said exactly one sentence, clearly, slowly, loud enough for the whole hallway to hear. "These things are not mine, and I believe the person who put them here knows that better than anyone." Then she fell silent, because the rest of her was busy keeping her knees from shaking and her mind from stopping. When her room was locked, the spare key hung in the butler's key cabinet, where anyone who knew the rhythm of the house would know to find it. How long had she been out of her room and downstairs in the kitchen last night? 20 minutes, half an hour, and like a cold blade cutting through fog, last night's memory returned with one detail she had missed because she had been too tense. The greenhouse light had gone out when she backed away from the flower path, but she had never heard the greenhouse door close. No footsteps returning to the main house on the gravel path. The person inside the greenhouse had remained in the dark, and the person who remained in the dark had seen the one standing outside the light. Delilah felt the blood drain from her face, not because of the shoebox, but because the calculation had just completed itself. Vanessa knew. She had known since last night. She had seen Delilah standing among the flowers and listening to every word. And while Delilah sat clutching the notebook and waiting for morning to tell the truth, that woman had used those very hours to act, swift, clean, precise, turning the would-be accuser into the accused before the sun had time to rise. At that exact moment, as if the scene had been timed for the stage, footsteps sounded at the end of the hallway, and Vanessa appeared in her silk robe, her hair slightly tousled in the look of someone newly awakened. She stopped short at the sight, looked at the box of money, looked at the recorder in Muller's hand, then looked at Delilah, and her face broke open into a pain and shock so perfect it reached every muscle. "No," she breathed, one hand pressed to her chest. "No, Miss Quinn, I don't believe it. Tell me it's a mistake. I've defended you so many times. Just last week, Massimo was talking about increasing your compensation. How could you?" Her voice caught exactly where it needed to catch. Her eyes reddened exactly as much as they needed to redden, and she turned to Muller with the look of someone forcing herself to do the hardest thing of her life. "Mr. Muller, this has to be reported to Mr. Falcone immediately." "I'm sorry, Miss Quinn. I'm truly sorry. But there are some things I can't stay silent about." The performance was so complete that the cook began to cry out of sympathy for the kind future mistress who had been betrayed. And Delilah, standing in the hallway with her honor bleeding out, looked straight into those reddened eyes, and in one brief fraction of a second shared only by the two women, deep beneath those perfect tears she saw it, unmistakable, a cold, still, satisfied gleam. The look of a hunter standing over prey lying neatly inside the trap she herself had set the night before. Massimo returned to the mansion at 8 o'clock in the morning, canceling his entire early day schedule, and in the dark wood study, he listened to Muller's report with the shoebox and the voice recorder placed on the desk like two pieces of evidence in a trial without a lawyer. He sent everyone out, sat alone with those two objects for nearly 20 minutes, and no one knew what the most powerful man in Chicago passed through during those 20 minutes. Only he knew that he pressed the button on the recorder, heard his own voice echo inside this room, phone calls recorded from the very place where he was sitting, and felt the sensation every corner of the underworld feared most, the feeling of being betrayed inside his own fortress. But at the same time, another voice, smaller, more stubborn, kept rising through the anger, like a piece of wood that refused to sink. The woman who pushed $10,000 back across this desk because she did not want to be thought of as someone who could sell her silence. That same woman had hidden $15,000 in a shoebox. The person who taught his daughter the game of calling Papa when she was afraid, that same person had recorded the child's father to sell him to his enemies. The two images did not fit, like two puzzle pieces from two different sets, and Massimo Falcone, the man who had survived this long by not believing in coincidences, was forced for the first time in his life to choose between two things that could not both be true: the physical evidence on the desk and the instinct inside his chest that no hand could touch. At 9 o'clock, Delilah was brought in. She stepped through that wooden door for the 4th time in her life, and this time, when the door closed behind her, she did what she had decided in her mind from the moment she stood in the servants' hallway. She did not wait to be questioned, did not stand there explaining herself. She walked straight to the front of the desk and knelt, both knees touching the wooden floor, her back still straight, her head still lifted, the posture of someone lowering herself but not lowering her dignity. And Massimo, who had been standing with his back turned at the window, turned around and stopped for one beat at the sight. "Miss Quinn, stand up. I don't accept." She cut him off, for the first and only time, her voice not loud but each word falling like stone onto the surface of a lake. "Sir, I'm not kneeling to beg you for mercy, because I didn't do what they say. I had never seen that money. I had never held that device. I am kneeling because I know that in your world, the word of a servant cannot weigh the same as evidence. So I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you for one thing only." Then she looked up, meeting his eyes across the wooden desk, and said the sentence she had been saving for the final moment. "Ask your daughter when she stopped speaking, and who helped her begin again. You don't have to believe me, you only have to believe her. Children don't know how to perform, sir. Adults do." The room remained silent for a very long time. Massimo looked at the woman kneeling before him without breaking, and inside him, the real battle was not taking place between him and her, but between the two men within himself, the boss and the father. The boss spoke in the voice of the law that had kept 3 generations of Falcones alive. Evidence was evidence. A traitor had to pay a price severe enough to make 100 others tremble just looking at it. Soften once, and the whole empire would read that softness like a death sentence. The father said nothing at all. The father placed only one image on the scale: the stack of pancakes leaning like the Tower of Pisa, and his daughter's bright laughter in Sunday sunlight, and Massimo stood between those two men, realizing the bitter truth that no matter which side he chose, he would lose. Believe her, and he would have to reopen everything, and reopening everything meant suspecting the woman he was supposed to marry in 2 days. Refuse to believe her, and the law of his world demanded a price that his hand, for the first time, did not want to sign. So he chose a third move, the move of a man standing in the middle, and later he would understand that it was the most cowardly move of his life. He walked around the desk, stopped in front of her, and spoke in a voice drained of every trace of warmth. "Miss Quinn, because of what you have done for my daughter, nothing will happen to you. That is all I can buy for you. You have 30 minutes to pack your things. A car will take you away from here. You will never return to this house. You will not contact anyone in this house, including the child, especially the child. 3 months' wages will be transferred to your account. Go, and don't let me see you again." Every word he spoke was straight, precise. and only he knew where each one had been cut from inside his chest. Delilah stood, said nothing more, bowed her head with the proper manners she had shown on her first day, and walked out. 30 minutes later, she crossed the main foyer for the last time, with the same 2 canvas bags she had carried when she arrived, the brown notebook still inside the apron she had taken off, now wrapped carefully at the bottom of one bag. The servants stood scattered through the foyer. No one dared say goodbye. Mrs. Brennan stood at the foot of the stairs, and when Delilah passed, the old woman's hand caught hers for 1 second, only 1 second, squeezed hard, then let go, without a word. But Delilah would carry that squeeze with her through the dark weeks ahead. Then, when she was still 10 steps from the front door, it happened. The sound of small slippers running fast across the marble came from the direction of the staircase, the nanny unable to catch up, and Bianca shot through the foyer like a tiny arrow, threw her arms around Delilah's leg, and held on with all the strength in her 4-year-old body. From that small chest burst the first scream of her new life, a scream that tore through the silence of the entire mansion, rang through the stone foyer, struck the high ceiling, slipped through the closed door of the study. Don't go, Della, don't go. The whole house went dead still. The cook began crying aloud in the corner of the foyer. The gardener turned his face all the way to the wall. Mrs. Brennan closed her eyes. Delilah knelt down, held the trembling child, pressed her lips to the brown hair, and whispered the last words she was allowed to say. Della's night, listen to me. Della has to go away for a while, but do you remember the rules of the castle? When you're afraid, you know what to do. You are the bravest knight in this kingdom, and your papa is the strongest person. You are never alone. Then she peeled each tiny finger from her dress, the hardest thing she had ever done in the 27 years she had lived on this earth, stood up, and walked straight out the door without looking back, because she knew that if she looked back even once, she wouldn't be able to leave. Behind her, Bianca's sobs broke open in the nanny's arms, and on the second floor, behind the window of the study, Massimo Falcone stood looking down, watching the taxi swallow that woman and roll through the iron gate, his hands gripping the windowsill so tightly, his knuckles turned white, while his daughter's scream kept echoing through his chest like a bell no one could silence. Don't go, 2 simple words that all his wealth couldn't buy, and those same 2 words, though he did not yet know it, would be the only thing still standing between him and a grave someone had already scheduled. The weekly motel in Cicero charged $210 a week for a room, with a window facing a brick wall, a mattress sagging in the middle, and the sound of the elevated train making the glass of water on the table tremble every 12 minutes. Delilah lay there for the first 3 days almost unable to get up, not because she was hungry, but because the feeling she had known by heart since she was 25 had returned in full, the feeling of someone who had just had life rip out of her hands everything she had managed to build. The 3 months' wages Massimo transferred arrived exactly as he had said they would, but almost all of it flowed straight to the collection agency according to the payment plan she had signed before, and what was left was enough for 6 weeks of motel rent and instant noodles. On the 3rd night, lying there listening to the train shriek past, she turned on her phone and checked the bus fare to Milwaukee, where an old friend of her mother's had once told her to come whenever she needed to. The screen lit up with the number $49, so cheap it almost felt like an invitation. Run. Start over. Forget that house. Forget the city that thinks you're a thief. Her finger had already moved toward the payment button, then stopped, because in her mind, without asking permission, the scream in the stone foyer that day rang out again. Don't go, Della, don't go. And layered over it was that terrifyingly calm voice in the night greenhouse. History will repeat itself just like 3 years ago. She turned off the screen, sat up in the dark, and dug the brown notebook out from the bottom of her canvas bag. She sat with it until nearly dawn, reading each line again, as though taking inventory of the last possessions she had left. And by the time the streetlights went dark and gave way to daylight, Delilah Quinn had completed the most important inventory of her life. They had taken her job, her honor in front of 11 people, the first roof she had truly had after 3 years. But there were 3 things they had not taken: her memory, this notebook, and the 2 feet that could still carry her. People run when they still have something to protect, she thought, but I have nothing left to lose except a child who will lose her father if I get on that bus. So I won't run, I'll dig. And from that morning on, The maid expelled from the Gold Coast began her new unpaid work with the only skill life had ever given her: invisibility. She had no gun, no badge, no money to hire an investigator, but she had the thing a lifetime of cleaning houses had sharpened: the ability to stand inside a space without anyone remembering she existed. And she had one living clue: the man in the gray coat, Doyle, the name Massimo himself had let slip in anger that night, working for the event company, the lie prepared in advance. But a good lie always borrowed a piece of the truth. The event company handling the wedding was real. Its name had been printed on the boxes, moving in and out of the mansion for the past month, Hartley Events on Ashland Avenue. And Delilah began there, not breaking in, not asking questions. She only did the most legal thing in the world, sitting at the bus stop across from the company gate with a 99-cent cup of coffee. Day after day, at different hours, a woman waiting for a bus. The most invisible creature in every American city. The first day, nothing. The third day, nothing. The fifth day, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the familiar gray sedan slid through the intersection, did not turn into Hartley Events, and Delilah understood she needed to change her way of thinking. He did not work there, he only borrowed that name. So she had to find him where he truly lived. She closed her eyes and searched the memory trained by her work. 3 encounters at the mansion, and the details no one else would ever notice, rose up like photographs developing in a dark room, the streaks of dry red mud clinging to the lower edge of the car door all 3 times, that kind of red clay found around Chicago only near certain construction sites along the southwest riverfront, the small orange access card clipped to the driver's side sun visor, the kind of pass private yards along the Calumet River issued to vehicles that came and went regularly, and once, when he bowed to Vanessa before leaving, the cuff of his gray sleeve had pulled back and revealed the face of his watch worn on the inside of his wrist, a habit of people who had once worked security or served in the military. Piece by piece, none of it proof, but together they drew a geographic area, and in the second week of her digging, Delilah moved her search down to the workers' diners along the Calumet River yards, getting herself a shift as a waitress at a breakfast place that paid cash by the day, where the counter window looked straight out over the parking lot of a warehouse complex, feeding herself while placing her eyes where they needed to be. And on the 11th day, the gray sedan rolled into that parking lot at 7 o'clock in the morning, as though arriving for work. From that day on, she served the man himself without him knowing. Doyle ate breakfast at the diner 3 times a week, always at the corner table, always fried eggs and black coffee, always sitting with his back to the wall and his face toward the door, the habit of a man in the trade. And Delilah poured coffee for him with the steady hands of a nameless waitress, while recording in memory every person who sat down at that table, most of them men from the yards, until Friday morning of the 3rd week, when a black SUV pulled up sharply in front of the diner, and the man who stepped out made the whole noisy place lower its voice by 1 degree. He was a man with close-cropped silver hair, shoulders like a door, and what Delilah would never forget was the way Doyle, who always sat at ease facing the door, sprang up from his chair while the other man was still 3 steps away, standing straight, hands at his sides, the exact posture she had seen the mansion guards take before Massimo. The silver-haired man did not sit. He only placed one hand on Doyle's shoulder and spoke for about a minute. Doyle nodded 4 times without interrupting once. Then the silver-haired man walked out, and as the SUV backed out of the lot, Delilah carried the coffee pot past the next table. At the exact moment, an old worker leaned toward his friend and whispered the sentence she would copy word for word into the brown notebook that night. "You know who just came in. One of Kovac's men, Bogdan Kovac." Folks around these docks hear that name and shut their mouths. I'm telling you, even the Falcone house over in the Gold Coast hears that old man's name and checks the locks twice. The coffee pot in Delilah's hand did not tremble. She filled 2 cups, said, "Here you go, gentlemen," with the smile of an invisible waitress, and walked back toward the counter, and only when her back was turned to the entire diner did she allow herself to swallow hard, because the last piece of the name had just locked into the chessboard. The man in the gray coat was not an event contractor. He was one of Bogdan Kovac's men, 55 years old, a name the underworld throughout this city spoke only in whispers, the lifelong enemy of everything, bearing the Falcone name, and the woman who was about to walk into the Gold Coast mansion, tomorrow wearing a wedding dress, was receiving orders, through that gray-coated man, from the very hand that had rested on Doyle's shoulder that morning. The name Kovac changed everything, because it turned the notes in the brown notebook from a marriage fraud scheme into a war between two families. And Delilah, sitting in the motel room that night with the map of everything she knew, realized that the only remaining gap lay in the 4 words she had heard among the rose bushes 3 years ago. If that sentence meant what she feared it meant, then somewhere in the past there had to be a trace left behind. People could erase witnesses, erase cameras, but no one could erase old newspapers. And the next morning, on her day off from the diner, she took 2 buses to the Harold Washington Library Center, where the 9th floor preserved microfilm and digitized records of every Chicago newspaper for the past 100 years. Public search computers did not ask for a user's name, and she typed into the search box the words she had been murmuring to herself all night: Accident, Dusable Lake Shore Drive, November 3 years ago. The result appeared on the second page, a short Tribune report, only 4 paragraphs long: a 34-year-old woman killed in a hit-and-run collision on Dusable Lake Shore Drive on a rainy Tuesday night. The victim confirmed as Caterina Falcone. A Gold Coast resident, her young child in the back seat, survived. Police asking witnesses for information about a dark-colored vehicle, leaving the scene at high speed, and Delilah sat before the microfilm screen, reading those 4 dry paragraphs again and again, staring at the distant photograph of the scene blurred by rain, the streaks of police lights bleeding across the wet road, and felt the brown notebook in her bag grow a ton heavier, because the next report, published 9 weeks later, was exactly 1 paragraph long. Chicago police confirmed the investigation into the Dusable Lake Shore Drive accident had been suspended due to insufficient evidence. No suspect had been arrested. 9 weeks. She was not a police officer, but she had seen enough news in her life to know that the death of a woman bearing the Falcone name having its case closed after 9 weeks meant either incompetence almost beyond belief, or that some hand wanted it closed quickly, and that thought gave birth to a second one, colder still. If 3 years ago there had been a hand long enough to close a homicide file, then, if she brought the brown notebook to the police today, how could she know whether she was handing it to justice or straight into that same hand? Who was she? A maid recently fired for theft with evidence found in her room, with an obvious motive for revenge. Would they believe her, or would they believe the report from the Falcone house security team? The answer slammed the door of the police station shut in front of her all by itself. But the first article held one detail those 4 short paragraphs could not hide. The reporter wrote that, according to investigative sources, the headlight fragments found at the scene belonged to a late-model SUV, and the police had traced a suspicious vehicle caught on camera by a gas station 3 miles from the scene, the vehicle registered under the name of a limited liability company. But that lead had gone nowhere because the company had been dissolved. One company name was mentioned exactly once in parentheses, Lakeview Consolidated Holdings, and Delilah copied that name into the notebook in the most careful handwriting of her life, because a dissolved company had meant a dead end for the police 3 years earlier. But for someone who had filled out death papers, debt papers, and bankruptcy papers for her own family, she knew one thing the article did not say. In America, even a dead company left behind a birth certificate, and the birth certificates of every company registered in Illinois were in the public records of the State Secretary of State's office, searchable for free, right on this library computer. She typed the name into the business search portal, and the record appeared after 3 seconds: Lakeview Consolidated Holdings. Formed 7 years ago, dissolved 2 years and 9 months ago, which meant only 3 months after that rainy night. The registered address a mailbox inside an office rental building in the Loop. The named director an unknown name that led nowhere. A perfect front. And Delilah was about to close the notebook in disappointment when her eyes slid to the final line of the record. The field every company in Illinois was required to have: registered agent, the individual or office authorized to receive legal papers on behalf of the company. And there, printed clearly in the public record of the state, unmistakable, was the line that made her ears ring in the silence of the library's 9th floor. Registered agent, the law office of Warren R. Hale and Associates, LaSalle Avenue, Chicago. She sat motionless for a very long time, hearing the blood run through her temples, and the completed chessboard arranged itself before her eyes with every piece in place, not a single pawn missing. Warren Hale, the Falcone family's lawyer of 20 years, the man the entire mansion spoke of as a guardian saint, had been the legal representative for the shell company that owned the vehicle tied to Caterina Falcone's death, which meant the inside man was not standing outside the mansion gate. He was sitting in the study, drinking Italian-style coffee, and this Friday afternoon he would be the one spreading the documents across the desk, documents transferring authority over assets, urged along by the new wife, into a legal structure he had designed. The whole game appeared so completely it made her sick. Kovacs did not need to fire a single bullet into the Gold Coast fortress. He sent a woman inside it to capture the heart, a lawyer to capture the signature, paperwork first, wedding first, and then, once all authority was legally in place, history would repeat itself just like 3 years ago. Another accident, another file closed after 9 weeks, and the Falcone empire would flow into enemy hands without anyone in the world being able to call it a robbery. Delilah printed the 2 articles and the business record page on the library printer for 30 cents, folded them into the brown notebook as one thin packet, and stepped out of the library as the sky was already leaning toward evening. Standing on the sidewalk along State Street in the middle of the rush-hour crowd, she made the final calculation. 5 weeks had passed since she was cast out, and the newly rescheduled wedding was now only days away. Today was Wednesday of the final week. The signing was set for this Friday afternoon, and the wedding for Saturday. She had less than 48 hours, a stack of papers, and not a single person in the world who believed her. Reason told her this was no longer her business, that she had been thrown out through that gate in humiliation, that the man had chosen not to believe her. But standing among the car horns and the river of strangers, what appeared in Delilah's mind was not Massimo's face, but a tiny hand placing a candy wrapped in gold paper on the lid of her cleaning bucket, the screen breaking open in the stone foyer, and she thought, if I stay silent, that child will be orphaned a second time before her 5th birthday. She has only just learned how to call out Papa again. No, I won't let anyone make her learn how to forget that word one more time. And Delilah Quinn tightened her grip on the strap of her canvas bag, merged into the crowd, and began calculating the road back to the one place on earth where she had been forbidden forever. During the 5 weeks Delilah spent digging on the outside, the Gold Coast mansion still looked intact from beyond the iron gate. Wedding flowers began arriving. Tents were being raised in the garden. But inside, the cracks running beneath the marble grew longer by the day, and the first crack lay in the sleep of the master of the house himself. Massimo discovered that his daughter's scream refused to grow old. Every night, it was the same. He would drift off for a little while, and the 2 words "don't go" would echo through his head again, with every shade of sound from that morning still intact. And what kept him awake was not the scream itself, but a comparison he could not drive from his mind. His daughter had stayed silent for 3 years after losing her mother, and she had screamed when she lost a maid. That small body, the one that had never known how to lie, had chosen for itself which person it could not lose, while he, her father, had stood behind a window and watched that person be driven away. The second crack widened inside the child's room. Bianca did not fall back into complete silence the way she had 3 years before, which perhaps would have been easier for those forced to witness it. She still answered when asked, still said yes politely, but her voluntary words slowly dried up like pond water in a season of drought. She stopped telling stories to Bunny. She stopped commanding the cinnamon sprinkling. Her meals had to be coaxed into her 1 spoonful at a time by the nanny, and the plates returned to the kitchen more than half full, leaving the cook wiping her eyes as she cleared them away. And Mrs. Brennan, who had now quietly taken upon herself as much of the child's care as she could, was the one who discovered 2 things she reported to no one. The first was in the drawer of Bianca's nightstand, a neat row of candies wrapped in shining paper of every color, exactly 1 more added each day. The dessert candies the child was given after dinner and did not eat. And when Mrs. Brennan asked what she was saving them for, the little girl looked at her with those deep brown eyes and answered in a voice so calm it tore the heart open, "For Della. When Della comes back, she'll have lots." The second was the drawing Mrs. Brennan found beneath the child's pillow one morning while changing the sheets, 3 crooked figures drawn in crayon, holding hands in front of a house with a fence. The tallest figure was colored black, the smallest stood in the middle, and the third figure had brown hair and was drawn almost as large as the black figure. Above them was a huge 5-pointed yellow star taking up half the sky. Mrs. Brennan stood in the sun-filled nursery, holding that sheet of paper for a long time, then folded it carefully and placed it in the pocket of her apron, instead of returning it beneath the pillow. She couldn't explain why she did it. She only knew that some evidence needed to be kept somewhere safer than a child's pillow. The third crack, and the deepest one, appeared on Monday night of the wedding week, when Paulie Russo knocked on the study door at 10 o'clock with a thin envelope in his hand. He did not sit down. He only placed the envelope on the desk and said, "Boss, I know the Quinn girls' case is closed. You didn't order any further investigation, so I did this on my own. Punish me if you want, but hear me out for 3 minutes first. For 30 years, I've followed your father's rule. When evidence looks too pretty, sniff it carefully. I had my people look over the cash in that shoebox. The result is in there. $15,000 in cash, 150 bills, and on all 150 of those bills, there isn't a single fingerprint, not the girls, not the guards who found it, not anyone's, wiped clean or counted with gloves. Boss, think about it. A broke maid hiding stolen money in a shoebox, why would she wipe off fingerprints? Would she even know to wipe them off? Amateur dirty money is always covered in prints. Money this clean is work done by professionals, prepared to be found, not hidden. As for the recorder, I traced the serial number. It was sold at an equipment store in the Loop, paid for in cash, 5 weeks ago, the very week before the girl was even under suspicion. You understand what I'm saying, don't you? Someone bought that device before there was even a reason for Quinn to betray you." Massimo sat motionless behind the desk, not touching the envelope, and before Paulie left, he said the sentence he had swallowed back in the car that day. "Boss, I'm not saying I know who did it. I'm only saying this trap was expensive, and in this house, the only poor person is the one who fell into it." The door closed, and Massimo sat alone with that thin envelope until well past midnight. The seed of doubt Paulie had planted did not explode like a bomb. It soaked in like water, slipping into every crack of the past 5 weeks, Bianca's eyes at every dinner, the row of candies in the drawer that Mrs. Brennan thought no one knew about, but that he had seen once when he came in to kiss his sleeping daughter. The sentence from the woman who had knelt in this room. "You don't have to believe me. You only have to believe the child." And for the first time, he allowed himself to think directly the thought he had been pushing down for 5 weeks. If it wasn't her, then who was it? That question had an ice-cold tail, because whoever set the trap had to be someone who could enter the servants' quarters, knew the search schedule, knew even that Delilah was about to open her mouth, which meant that person was inside this house, eating at the same table, breathing the same air as him and his daughter. But just as the seed of doubt touched the root, the one who watered it was Vanessa, with a move whose precision Massimo would only fully recognize later. On Tuesday night, she knocked on the study door with a carefully measured look of confusion. "Darling, I just spoke with Warren. He says the document signing on Friday afternoon must be handled with absolute privacy, since the wedding is already Saturday morning, and it would be awkward if guests started arriving early. So he asked whether we should finalize the exact arrangements to ensure no one interrupts us. I suppose he's right to be cautious. But actually, that isn't why I came up here." She sat down on the edge of the chair and folded her hands together. "I came because of the child. Massimo, it's been 5 weeks, and I can't bear watching her anymore. She's wilting day by day. I know you're angry with me because I once mentioned the school in Connecticut. I take it back. I've thought about it carefully. The child needs to be close to her father. It's just," her voice softened, velvet gentle, "I'm afraid this house still has too many shadows from the people before, the old maid, the old habits, the old memories. If the child keeps being held inside memory, how can she heal? Maybe after the wedding, we should take her far away for a while, just the 3 of us, and begin again from the beginning, like a real family." She looked at him with green eyes shimmering with tears, perfect down to the 1,000th of a second, the woman who had skillfully confirmed the Friday signing schedule, as if it were nothing more than a minor logistical detail, while wrapping herself completely in the role of a devoted stepmother. And Massimo looked at her, nodded slowly, and said, "Yes, I'll think about it," in the gentle voice of a man about to become a husband, while in the deepest layer of the boss inside him, where 37 years of survival had taught him never to shut off any sense completely, a compass needle had just trembled, Very slightly, only very slightly. But for the first time in 8 months, it no longer pointed only toward the woman sitting in front of him. On Friday morning, 48 hours before the wedding, the iron gate of the Falcone mansion opened more often than it closed. Tent company trucks, sound company vans, and vehicles carrying tables and chairs followed one another through the checkpoint where 2 security guards compared every name against a 3-page list. And Delilah stood 2 blocks away in the green polo uniform of Bella Fiore florist, which she had spent 4 days obtaining, not through theft or forgery, but through the simplest way in the world. The flower shop that had won the biggest wedding contract of the year needed extra seasonal help for loading and carrying on Friday only, paid in cash, and a woman with experience arranging flowers, who knew how to work and accepted an early shift, was hired after a 3-minute interview in which no one bothered to ask for her full name. Life had taught her that the strongest door did not always have to be pried open. Sometimes it opened by itself for those who looked small enough. Her plan fit into 1 sentence. Enter with the flowers, find Polly Russo, hand over the file and leave. She had calculated the exit too. If she couldn't find Polly before 11 o'clock, she would tuck the file into the one place in the mansion she knew for certain Mrs. Brennan checked every afternoon, the table linen cabinet in the kitchen, with 3 words written on the outside, "Give Mr. Russo," and then she would get out. That file now lay pressed against her stomach beneath the polo shirt, wrapped twice in plastic bags, the brown notebook, the 2 news reports, the business record page bearing the name of the law office of Warren R. Hale, everything she had in the world. At 9:15, the Bella Fiore truck rolled through the gate, Delilah sitting in the back with 3 other helpers, her heart beating up into her throat when the security guard leaned into the truck bed and counted heads. 4 matched the list, and just as he was about to slam the door shut, his eyes stopped on her face 1 second too long. "Do I know you?" The question came out half joking, half serious, and Delilah, who had prepared for this exact moment by cutting her hair a handspan shorter and dyeing it 2 shades darker the week before, lifted her face and looked straight at him instead of lowering it, because people who were hiding were the ones who lowered their faces, and she laughed. "You probably saw me at some wedding or other. This season I'm carrying flowers for 3 or 4 a week." The guard shrugged and laughed along, slammed the truck door, and the vehicle rolled inside. She breathed out very slowly through her teeth, knowing she had just crossed over truly thin ice. That guard was a new hire who had started after her time there. He could only have seen her in a personnel file photo, and luckily for her, people did not remember the faces of maids in photographs for very long. For the next 3 hours, Delilah did exactly the work she had been hired to do, carrying boxes of white roses from the truck to the tent area in the garden, and as she worked, she read the old house again with new eyes. The security team was twice as large as usual, but most of them were concentrated along the outer perimeter and around the tent. The vendor path had been roped off separately along the side of the house. Everything matched her memory except for one strange thing she heard straight from the mouths of 2 technicians arguing near the electrical panel. One of them, holding a radio, grumbled that he had already said the whole East Wing cluster was shut off, orders from above, the bride's request, the private rooms and the East Wing hallway were not to be filmed or photographed until after the wedding. It was people's privacy. What was there to question? Delilah was carrying a box of flowers past them, and her steps did not slow at all, but inside her head an alarm bell screamed without stopping. The East Wing hallway, the corridor connecting the kitchen to the service stairs and the reading room, the route anyone wanting to move discreetly through this house would have to use. That woman had turned off the eyes of an entire wing of the house 2 days before history was scheduled to repeat itself. A hole had been dug in the middle of the house. The only thing not yet known was what it was meant to bury. A little before 11, Polly Russo was still nowhere to be seen. One helper told her she had heard the bodyguards saying that the old butler and the boss's assistant were both at St. Michael's Church handling the ceremony arrangements. Delilah bit her lip and looked at the time. Plan A was dead. She shifted to Plan B, the kitchen, the table linen cabinet, and that was why, at 11:07, she took off her cloth gloves, used the excuse of looking for the employee restroom, separated from the stream of workers near the tent, circled around through the familiar drying yard, pushed open the side door. She knew was never locked before 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and stepped into the east wing corridor. The hallway was strangely quiet compared with the bustle outside in the garden, its tall windows pouring sunlight onto the stone floor in bright pools. She moved quickly, close to the wall, the file under her shirt growing hot with every heartbeat. 15 steps to the kitchen door, 10 steps, and at that exact moment, from the turn where the service staircase came down, a voice sounded behind her, sweet, slow, and clear as ice water. I was under the impression that the flower crew was only allowed to work outside under the tent. Delilah froze for one beat before turning around, and Vanessa Sterling stood there in the camera-free hallway she herself had created, wearing the ivory silk dress for her fitting, brutally beautiful, her arms loosely folded, her head tilted slightly, looking at Delilah from hair to shoes and then back up again, and the smile blooming on that face was not the smiles of someone who had caught an intruder, but the smile of someone who had just been given an early gift. "Well," she said, "new hair, new uniform, but even dye can't change the posture of someone who scrubs floors, can it, Miss Quinn? 5 weeks, hasn't it been? I'll have to admit, you're braver than I thought, sneaking back into the very house that threw you out for stealing." Delilah did not step back. She had crossed the point where she was allowed to be afraid a very long time ago. She stood straight, her voice low and flat. "I came to repay the last of my debt to this house, Miss Sterling. Once that is done, I'll leave. We don't need to bother each other." "Oh." Vanessa stepped down one stair then another, her heels striking the stone in dry little taps. "A debt, how interesting, and to whom exactly?" "The child, I suppose. I heard she cried for a few days and then stopped. Children are like that. They change servants the way they change stockings. In a few more months, she won't even remember your face." She stopped 3 steps away from Delilah, her green eyes sliding downward, slow, professional. That assessing glance Delilah had seen on the very first day. Only this time it stopped at the front of her polo shirt, where beneath the green fabric, no matter how tightly she had pressed it flat, the hard square edge of the file still showed, and in that sun-flooded hallway without a single electronic eye to witness it, Delilah saw those green eyes change color. The smile remained on her lips, but everything behind it had gone out, leaving only the still, cold gaze of a predator that had finished identifying what its prey was carrying in its belly. And when Vanessa spoke again, her voice had stripped away all its sugar, leaving only the blade beneath. "What's under your shirt, Miss Quinn?" No one answered that question, and Delilah's silence itself was the answer. She stepped back half a pace, and Vanessa lunged faster than any calculation could follow, impossibly fast for a woman who lived year-round in silk dresses. The hand with ivory-painted nails seized the collar of the polo shirt and tore it open. The file wrapped in plastic fell onto the stone floor along with the ceramic vase, from the shelf they struck during the struggle, the sound of shattering pottery exploding through the empty hallway like a gunshot. Vanessa glanced down at the file for only half a second, but half a second was enough for her to read the words Warren R. Hale printed on the record page exposed through the torn plastic, and Delilah saw the last trace of humanity in those green eyes snap out. "You," Vanessa's voice was no longer a voice, but a hiss forced through her teeth. "You dug all the way to that." Then those 2 hands tightened around Delilah's throat and shoved her back against the wall, not in a burst of anger, but as a decision. Delilah heard her spine slam into cold stone, heard her own breath break in half. Her hands clawed at those wrists, nails digging into flesh, and the woman before her, the face once beautiful as a magazine cover, now only a handspan from her own, whispered in the calm voice that had returned, the voice from the night in the greenhouse. "Who do you think you are, you floor scrubber? You think I got all the way to the door of this house by sparing girls like you? Let me tell you a secret, and you can take it to the grave. 3 years ago, I erased a woman from this house, a woman with the Falcone name no less, smooth as silk. This whole city called it an accident, so what exactly do you think you are?" Delilah's lungs burned. The edges of her vision began to blur into gray spots, but the words 3 years ago, I erased, cut through that fog like a needle. It was her, that mother. The first and only confession in the world about the rainy night on the lakeshore road, spoken in a place without cameras, without witnesses, for a future corpse to hear. And Delilah, with everything she had left, planted one foot against the wall and twisted sideways, the twist of someone who had once had to learn how to break free from the hands of debt collectors. Enough to send both women crashing sideways into the wooden shelf. Enough for one brief breath to enter her lungs, and she used that breath not to call for grown-ups, because this hallway had been emptied of grown-ups in advance, but to call one name toward the door at the end of the corridor, where she knew someone was still sitting alone with puzzles every morning. Bianca. Only once, choked, torn, and then that hand tightened again, deeper. Behind the reading room door at the end of the hallway, Bianca Falcone was sitting on the rug with a half-built castle before her. She had heard the pottery break and lifted her head. She had heard the muffled thuds echo through the wall, and then she heard her own name, called in a voice she would recognize among 1,000 voices. Delilah's voice, but warped, strangled, so full of pain that the 4-year-old child did not need anyone to explain that this was the sound of someone being afraid. That tiny body froze for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds the adults in that house would owe their lives to forever. Because in those 3 seconds, the little girl did not do what every child would have done. She did not open the door and run out. She remembered the rule of the castle. When something frightens you, you do not stand in the hall. You go to the watchtower, and the watchtower was this room. Bianca scrambled to her feet, ran to the door, rose on tiptoe, and with both tiny trembling hands turned the round button on the knob, just as she had practiced with the blanket-winged dragon. Click. Then she backed away, pressed her back to the bookcase, pulled up her sleeve, and looked down at the sky-blue watch printed with a night sky on her wrist. The yellow 5-pointed star rose along the side, the magic star used only when Bunny was truly afraid, and Bunny had never been as afraid as now. Her tiny thumb pressed down on the star and held it tight. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Nearly 9 miles to the south, inside a closed conference room on the top floor of a building in the Loop, Massimo Falcone was seated along the long side of a conference table, facing 3 representatives introduced as goodwill intermediaries. A peace talk Warren Hale had arranged over the past 2 weeks for a reason that could not have sounded more reasonable: to extinguish every friction with the southern groups before he entered his honeymoon. Hale himself sat on Massimo's right, pouring water, and in the middle of the first intermediary's sentence, Massimo's phone, lying face down on the table, began to vibrate. He glanced down, meaning to dismiss it, then his whole body turned to stone. On the screen was a line he had seen only once before, on that Sunday afternoon with the blanket-winged dragon. A call from Bianca's watch. He answered in the middle of the whole table's irritation, and his daughter's voice poured into his ear, whispering but shattered, breathless yet clear, each word landing like a hammer blow. "Papa, I'm in the watchtower. I locked the door. I followed the rules." "But Papa," Della came back. "Della is in the hallway. Miss Vanessa is hurting Della. I heard it. Della called me and then she went quiet. Papa, come home. Come home fast. You are the strongest person." Everyone in that conference room saw the boss of the Falcone family shoot to his feet, the heavy leather chair toppling backward behind him, the tabletop trembling beneath the 2 fists he braced against it. And the man famous throughout Chicago for never raising his voice roared into a second phone in a voice that made the speaking intermediary swallow his sentence back into his throat. "Muller, lock down the mansion, right now. Seal every gate. No one leaves. No one. Do you hear me? No one. Pull every man you have to the East Wing hallway." Then he rushed for the door, leaving his coat on the chair, and in the final instant before the conference room door slammed shut, Massimo still heard his daughter whisper the last sentence into the phone, the sentence that would follow him all the way to the grave. "Papa, hurry. Della is mine. 9 minutes." That was all Massimo's convoy needed to tear the city in half from the Loop back to the Gold Coast. Running red lights, cutting through intersections in the scream of sirens, and during those 9 minutes, in the East Wing hallway, Delilah Quinn fought with everything left from a life that had never surrendered. She clawed, she pulled, she threw her weight sideways, and dragged her attacker into the wooden shelf, holding on second by second with the one thought still burning in the gray fog: "The child has locked the door. I only have to stay alive a little longer." And then she heard it, cutting through the roar of blood in her ears, the thunder of footsteps rushing in from both ends of the hallway, the lockdown orders crackling through radios. The 2 hands around her throat suddenly released when Vanessa realized what was coming, but it was already too late. Every gate had been locked, every route had men on it, and when Massimo rushed into the East Wing hallway, with sunlight stretching long across the stone floor, scattered with shards of pottery and loose pages, what he saw would carve itself into him forever. Delilah was collapsed on her knees by the wall. one hand clutching her bruised throat, still trying to lean her body over the file, and Vanessa stood in the middle of the hallway, her hair fallen loose, the mask of 8 months shattered beyond any hope of being put back together. Though to her credit, she still tried. Even at the last second, she still tried. "Massimo, thank God you got here in time. This woman broke in. She attacked me. I was only defending myself." But Massimo was no longer listening. He knelt beside Delilah and lifted her with hands trembling in a way no one in his empire had ever seen them tremble. His eyes stopped on the finger marks carved around her neck, then dropped to the pages strewn across the floor, the old article about the rainy night 3 years earlier, and the business record page with the line registered agent, Warren R. Hale Law Office. He picked up that page very slowly, and at that exact moment, behind the bodyguards, a figure quietly shifted toward the door. Warren Hale, who had desperately tried to slip out of the loop conference room, the moment Massimo roared the lockdown order, was already tightly gripped by Paulie Russo's men, caught before he could even reach the elevator, and was now being dragged into the hallway in cuffs. 20 years of trust collapsed without needing a single word, only one look between two old men, and the file in the boss's hand. The entire hallway held its breath, waiting for what their world called law. The dozen or so people standing there all knew how that law worked with traitors, and Massimo Falcone rose to his feet and walked toward Vanessa, step by step, the fury inside him strong enough to burn down an entire row of houses. But then he stopped because over her shoulder, at the end of the hallway, he saw the reading room door still closed, still locked, where his daughter was sitting and waiting in the watchtower, believing her father was the strongest person in the kingdom. And the strongest person in the kingdom understood in that moment that real strength did not lie in what he could do to these two people, but in what he chose not to do on the threshold of his child's innocence. He took out his phone, and in the stunned silence of all his men, dialed a number no one expected. "Federal Bureau of Investigation Office, this is Massimo Falcone. I need to report a murder conspiracy, an assault that just occurred in my home, and evidence connected to a case from 3 years ago that needs to be reopened." Then he looked straight at Vanessa and Hale, his voice calm enough to chill the blood. "A bullet can only make you pay for one life. A court will make you pay with the whole truth, and the truth lasts longer. It hurts much more." When the federal agents escorted those two through the main foyer, Vanessa turned back one last time, her green eyes driving into Delilah, along with a soft hiss. "This isn't over." Maid and Massimo took one step, placing himself completely between the two women, answering on behalf of the whole house. "She is not a maid. She is the reason this house still exists." In the months that followed, justice moved slowly and surely, like gears turning. Testimony, the Brown file, the voice recorder traced backward, all of it tore open Bogdan Kovac's network. Katerina's accident file was reopened, and this time no one could close it after 9 weeks. And inside the mansion, healing began with a sentence that man had never said to anyone in his life. "I'm sorry," he told Delilah one afternoon in the garden. "I punished the person who told the truth so I could keep the liar beside me. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm only asking you to give me the chance to make it right." And Delilah, who was invited back not with a cleaning bucket but with equal respect, answered with the same quiet strength that had always belonged to her. "I'm staying because of the child. Everything else has to be rebuilt from the beginning, with time, not money." And they did rebuild it slowly, through dinners with no servant standing by, through evenings when Massimo clumsily learned how to braid his daughter's hair under the stern supervision of both teacher and student. Through the greatest decision of his life, gradually shrinking the dark reaches of his empire and bringing it toward the light, because as he told Paulie, "The greatest empire I need to protect is 3 feet tall and has only just learned how to say Papa again." 1 year later, on a sun-filled Sunday morning, that kitchen once again smelled of pancakes. Bianca chattered without stopping as though trying to give the world back the 3 years of silence it had lost, and on top of the kitchen cabinet, inside a small glass frame, the sky-blue children's watch with the yellow star button was displayed with honor like a medal belonging to the entire family. This story will soon come to a close, but there is one thing I would like to leave with all of you listening now. In the most powerful house in that city, the poorest person was the only one who did not sell the truth, and the smallest voice was the voice that saved them all. Life around us is the same. A person's worth has never rested in the clothes they wear, or the amount of money in their pocket, but in what they are able to keep when they have nothing left to lose. Please don't look past the quiet people around you. The janitor, the housekeeper, the server. Kindness has no uniform and truth needs no title. Sometimes just one act of respect at the right time, one sincere moment of listening, is enough to save an entire family, just as it happened in today's story. And what about you? How do you feel about this story? Which detail made your heart tighten the most? The scream of "Don't go in the stone foyer," or the call from the star button of a 4-year-old girl? In your own real life, have you ever met someone as quiet and kind as Delilah? Please share what you feel from deep inside your heart in the comments below. We read every line you share, and we treasure every true life story you entrust to us. If today's story touched you, please press the like button, share this video with your family and friends, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the emotional, meaningful stories we bring to you every day. Finally, I wish all of you watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace and calm in each passing day. Thank you for staying with us until the final moments of this story. Goodbye.